stopped. A strange sensation crept through Jinho. He glanced around, sensing something, but the hallway was empty. Kim noticed and asked if anything was wrong, to which Jinho only muttered that it was nothing. They continued walking until the pair finally disappeared around the corner. From a quiet patch of shadow behind them, Jinwoo stepped out. He had been there the whole time, observing without a word. Watching Jinho grieve had stirred something deep in him. He had come to the hospital unsure of what to do, but now his resolve was clear. Reaching into his inventory, he pulled out a bottle of the elixir of life. Outside, a car pulled up. Jinhee stepped out and hurried into the hospital. A sense of heaviness settled on her as she entered the corridor, her pace slowing. She passed by someone, just a blur in her peripheral vision, but gave it no thought as she reached her father's room. What she saw inside stopped her breath. President Yu was awake. Her eyes flooded with tears as she rushed to his side, stammering with disbelief. He was just as shocked, asking the nearby doctor how this was possible. The doctor, equally stunned, could only describe it as a miracle, something without precedent. While the room filled with emotion, Jinwoo quietly slipped out through a back exit, unnoticed. Walking alone beneath the pale light outside, he allowed himself a rare, quiet smile. With the bottle now empty and the weight of his decision behind him, he muttered softly into the night, wishing Jinho an early happy birthday. This was his gift to him. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Maryland, the U.S. government held a grand celebration, honoring the hunters who had successfully cleared the recently emerged S-rank gate within the state. The atmosphere inside the venue was relaxed, filled with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and casual banter. Hunters mingled freely, some marveling at the sheer scale of the event, others simply enjoying the rare chance to unwind. Then, without warning, a towering figure in a bright Hawaiian shirt stepped in from behind. Conversations quieted for a moment as heads turned toward him. It was Thomas Andre. He didn't say much, just reminded the group about a bet they'd made. His presence alone was enough to make a few of them shift nervously. With a grin, Thomas leaned toward one hunter and casually asked for his tie. The man hesitated, sweat beginning to form, but didn't argue. Wordlessly, he removed the tie and handed it over. Just as the laughter began to return, Thomas's assistant, Laura, entered the room, her tone bringing a different kind of attention. She informed Thomas that the list of guilds participating in the upcoming International Guild Conference had just been released. Among them was Korea's Ajin Guild. Thomas paused for a second, the name unfamiliar, until Laura added that it belonged to Sung Jinwoo. That's when a smirk slowly crept across Thomas Andre's face. Korea's strongest hunter was coming to the States, and Thomas couldn't wait to meet him. The world was bracing for major changes, with only a few days left until the upcoming International Guild Conference, an event set to bring together the world's most powerful guilds under one roof. But just days before the prestigious summit, a major turning point quietly unfolded in the heart of America. A helicopter descended onto the grounds of a vast, luxurious estate nestled in the countryside. The mansion belonged to Christopher Reed, one of the few national-level hunters in existence. As the blade slowed, Christopher emerged onto the front steps, watching as the vice director of the Hunter Command Center stepped out, followed by a composed but tense-looking Norma Selner. He raised an eyebrow, mildly surprised to see them. He hadn't been informed of any visits today. Still, he motioned for them to come inside, his voice cool as he noted that if they were here about a newly spawned S-rank gate out east, they were wasting their time. He had no interest in getting involved. But the vice director shook his head, saying that it wasn't about a gate. It was something far more urgent. Christopher led them into a private room and instructed his maid to ensure no one came near. As they settled, he sat comfortably and asked what this was really about. He could already tell from their faces that it wasn't routine business. Norma Selner sat down across from him, her tone calm but firm as she explained that this visit wasn't about a crisis. They had come to warn him. According to her visions, his life was in danger. He would be murdered soon. A nerve hit Christopher the moment the words slipped from Miss Selner's mouth. He slammed his teacup onto the table, the sharp clink slicing through the heavy silence. Without looking up, his voice dropped low and serious as he said he was grateful for everything she had done for him in the past, but they weren't close enough for her to make jokes like this. Then his gaze slowly lifted to meet hers, cold and sharpened, a quiet storm in his eyes. Christopher reminded her who she was speaking to. The weight in his voice pressed into the room like a vice. Despite the pressure, Miss Selner didn't flinch. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, recalling the vision that haunted her. She calmly revealed that she had dreamt of him recently, surrounded by men, with a heavy sense of danger closing in on him. It wasn't a vague unease. It was certainty. She knew he was going to die, but Christopher's patience had already begun to fracture. The idea that she'd flown all the way out here to spout what he saw as nonsense left a sour taste in his mouth. His tone rose, edged with anger, as he questioned whether she really expected a national-level hunter to believe he could be killed. Unmoved, Miss Selner pushed forward. She spoke of fate, inevitability, and the one sliver of hope she believed still existed. Christopher scoffed at the idea, asking if she truly thought there was anyone in this world capable of protecting someone like him. He declared, with full confidence, that no such person existed, but Miss Selner disagreed. "There might be one," she said quietly. Christopher narrowed his eyes, watching her carefully as she uttered a name, Sung Jinwoo. He fell silent, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his expression as Miss Selner turned and walked out, leaving behind only doubt in her wake. That night at Christopher Reed's mansion, the atmosphere was thick and heavy, the kind of silence that felt too perfect. Christopher lay asleep in his bed, but the calm was broken as he abruptly sat up, eyes sharp. Something had stirred him. He slipped on his robe and stepped out into the dim hallway, guided by instinct rather than reason. As he walked, the unnatural stillness clung to him. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. Suspicion rising, Christopher grabbed a wine glass from a nearby table and, in one swift motion, hurled it down the empty corridor. The glass shattered, but no sound followed. That silence confirmed it. Something was here. A chill ran through him as his thoughts drifted back to Miss Selner and the vice director, to their warning. He hadn't believed them, but now, he felt it. Something powerful lurked nearby. Just then, a man with blonde hair appeared, standing at the far end of the hall with a serene smile, his hands tucked behind his back. Christopher's senses flared. Two more presences stood behind him, silent but unmistakable. Without turning, he demanded they reveal themselves, but the blonde man wasn't focused on him. He raised his gaze slightly and, in the language of monsters, spoke, directed not at Christopher, but at something beyond. He said that if the fragment of light continued to accommodate humans, no one would be saved. Christopher's brow furrowed. The words made no sense. What was he talking about? But the man dismissed him, told him to be silent, claiming the conversation wasn't meant for him. He was speaking to something above Christopher, something connected to him. Those words struck a nerve. In an instant, fire surged around Christopher. His body ignited, his form expanding and morphing until it became something no longer human. Engulfed in flames, he declared with fury that at least one of them would die here. The two figures standing behind him watched his transformation in awe, unable to comprehend how a human could achieve spiritualization. But Christopher didn't wait. He lunged forward at the blonde intruder, unleashing his power. Flames roared through the mansion, devouring everything in their path as the clash shook the very walls. The outcome of the battle remained unknown, but the destruction it left behind was undeniable. Meanwhile, in Japan, it was Jinwoo's last day as he headed toward the airport in a sleek black car, accompanied by a full convoy. The streets were flooded with thousands of people, all gathered for one last glimpse of the man who had saved their city. The sheer number of onlookers had even Beru suggesting that his liege raise a hand like a king to acknowledge them. But Jinwoo shut the idea down without hesitation. He wasn't interested in basking in attention. The convoy soon reached the airport. Jinwoo exchanged brief farewells with the officials before boarding his flight back to Korea. As he settled into his seat, he noticed a familiar face in the seat beside him, Adam White of the Federal Bureau of Hunters. Jinwoo couldn't help but wonder if this was just coincidence or another deliberate approach by the Bureau. Adam didn't beat around the bush. With a shrug, he admitted it outright. Jinwoo greeted him coolly, recalling their previous meeting, and asked what brought him here this time. Adam, well aware that showing up unannounced crossed a few lines, explained there was something urgent he needed to discuss. Immediately, Jinwoo's mind went to the worst. He asked if the U.S. had failed to contain the S-rank gate. Adam quickly reassured him it had been handled, but what he had to show Jinwoo was something else, something far more serious. Wasting no time, Adam pulled out his laptop and opened a video file. The screen showed thick black smoke curling into the sky like from a massive wildfire. Flames blazed violently, firefighters scrambling to get control as chaos unfolded. Jinwoo's eyes narrowed as he studied the footage and asked what exactly he was looking at. Adam's tone turned grim as he revealed the truth. The man responsible for the destruction was Christopher Reed. Despite deploying 1,800 firefighters and 14 high-tier hunters, they had struggled to contain the fire that Christopher had unleashed. Jinwoo instantly recognized the scale of the disaster. For flames that wild, there had to have been a serious battle. He asked what had become of Christopher. Adam paused the video, freezing it on an image of Christopher's scorched body, riddled with wounds. He said that by the time they found him, Christopher was already dead. Then, Adam reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a photograph, the man they believed was behind the incident. The moment Jinwoo laid eyes on the picture, something in him snapped. Without warning, he activated ruler's authority. Adam was yanked from his seat mid-air, crushed invisibly by immense pressure as his laptop was flattened into scrap. Screaming in pain, Adam found himself at the mercy of Jinwoo's darkened gaze. Jinwoo warned him coldly that if this was some kind of twisted joke, Adam wouldn't leave the plane alive. Panicked, Adam waved off the bodyguards who had started to react. He hurriedly explained that the man in the photo had emerged from a dungeon, that it might not be who Jinwoo thought. Still struggling to breathe, Adam went on. The man's energy felt less like a hunter's and more like a monster's. He revealed that the explosion at the Hunter Bureau's headquarters a few months ago was this man's doing too. Jinwoo slowly released his grip, letting ruler's authority fade. The name of his father, the face in that photo, all of it churned inside him in disbelief. As tension started to ease, Adam, still catching his breath, continued. The suspect had already attacked several S-rank hunters before disappearing. He acknowledged the emotional weight of what this meant for Jinwoo, but said all signs still pointed to the man in the photo. Jinwoo, his expression now unreadable, asked why Adam had shown this to him. Adam replied that it concerned the upcoming International Guild Conference. The U.S. Bureau planned to issue a red notice on the suspect. Until now, the investigation had been confidential, but that was about to change. They wanted to give Jinwoo advance notice before making the wanted poster public at the conference he was scheduled to attend. The U.S. Hunter Association had lost a national-level hunter. They were prepared to pursue the culprit with everything they had, and out of respect, they had decided to tell Jinwoo first. Jinwoo sat there, silent. His father, missing for 10 years, had returned, and possibly not as the man he once was. That truth weighed heavily on him. Adam, meanwhile, despite the pain still lingering in his chest, found himself quietly awed. Telekinesis wasn't unheard of among high-tier magic hunters, but what Jinwoo had just demonstrated was on an entirely different scale. It was the kind of power only national-level hunters could wield. There was no longer any doubt in Adam's mind. Jinwoo was the 6th national-level hunter, a fact the vice director would need to hear. The anticipation surrounding the International Guild Conference only intensified with time. The U.S. Hunters Association soon released the official list of participating guilds, and one name in particular caught the world's attention: Korea's Ajin Guild. Discussions ignited across the globe. People questioned the rationale behind inviting a guild with only a single high-ranking hunter. But the message was clear: that one hunter was worth more than all the guilds boasting multiple top-class hunters combined. Jinwoo's name was everywhere. As the conference neared, he became the focal point of global attention, and the first ripple of its impact reached the Korean Hunter Association. Chief Woo Jinchul entered President Go's office with an urgent report in hand. He explained that China had submitted a request for information on Jinwoo, specifically raid records and any published data related to him. President Go raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. He couldn't understand why China would be after Jinwoo when the hunter had already made it clear that he had no interest in joining foreign organizations or leaving Korea. But Jinchul clarified that the request hadn't come from the Chinese government. It came from an individual. The moment he revealed the name, President Go froze. Liu Zhigang, China's 7-star hunter, had personally asked for Jinwoo's information. The thought that someone of Liu Zhigang's caliber had taken an interest in Jinwoo hit President Go hard. Jinchul added that it likely had something to do with Liu's past battle against a giant monster. After hearing of Jinwoo's solo annihilation of the giants in Japan, Liu Zhigang had grown curious about the Korean hunter's capabilities. A knowing smile spread across President Go's face as he absorbed the revelation. Then, with a wave of his hand, he ordered Jinchul to reject the request, or at most, provide only surface-level data. Nothing substantial about Jinwoo was to be shared. Meanwhile, at the Scavenger Guild, the atmosphere was heavy as preparations for the conference ramped up. Laura entered Thomas Andre's office with an update. Jinwoo was scheduled to arrive in the country the next day. As Thomas reviewed his calendar, the door creaked open. The person he'd summoned had arrived. Without any build-up, Thomas stepped forward, his expression firm, and delivered his warning. No matter what happened, Sung Jinwoo was not to be touched. Hwang Dong-su's face tightened, with a mix of nervousness and barely contained frustration. Thomas saw it and continued, making it clear he knew everything that had gone down between Jinwoo and Dong-su's brother. He understood Dong-su's thirst for closure, but that was all in the past. Dong-su opened his mouth to protest, but Thomas lifted a finger. The weight of his presence silenced Dong-su instantly. Fear flickered in the S-rank hunter's eyes as he stood frozen under the guildmaster's pressure. From across the room, Laura watched it all unfold. The tension was unmistakable. Very few people in the world could deliver such a command to someone like Dongsu, but Thomas was not most people. Placing a heavy hand on Dongsu's shoulder, Thomas repeated himself. No contact with Jinwoo, no matter the circumstance. To remove Dongsu from the equation during the conference, Thomas suggested a vacation at the guild resort, far from the action. A long pause followed. Then Dongsu finally gave a stiff nod, jaw clenched, before turning and leaving the office. But even after his departure, Laura could feel it. Dongsu hadn't truly let go of his grudge. She turned to Thomas, questioning whether it was wise to let him walk out so easily. Thomas, well aware of the risk, gave his response without hesitation. Dongsu wasn't one to back down, which is why Laura was to keep a close eye on him until Jinwoo left the country. Otherwise, he warned, Dongsu wouldn't live to see another day. Finally, the day arrived. The top hunters from the world's most powerful guilds landed in the United States for the International Guild Conference. The air buzzed with excitement, and the energy in the crowd was electric. Among the arrivals stood Leonard Nierman, Germany's top hunter and guildmaster of the Richter Guild. Reporters swarmed like bees, cameras flashing non-stop. Leonard, noting the chaos ahead, glanced at his vice guildmaster and asked what all the noise was about. The man explained that the Korean hunter everyone had been talking about had just landed. Leonard's eyes scanned the crowd until they fell on Jinwoo across the lot. He nodded slightly, deciding he should take the opportunity to introduce himself and build rapport. Straightening his coat and adjusting his steps with confidence, he moved forward, but then, without warning, stopped cold. His vice guildmaster looked puzzled, asking if he was going to keep walking. Leonard, still staring, muttered under his breath as realization struck. He had assumed Jinwoo summoned his shadow army from another dimension, but this was different. They were walking with him. Always. Leonard didn't see a hunter arriving for a conference. He saw a king arriving for war. Jinwoo, aware of the eyes locked on him, looked over subtly. Jinho, noticing the glance, asked if someone caught his eye. Jinwoo simply replied that some foreigner had been staring for a while, prompting Jinho to chuckle and joke that maybe the guy was a fan, hoping for an autograph. Before the conversation could continue, Adam White approached with a team from the U.S. Hunters Bureau. He welcomed the group with professional ease, handling the pleasantries quickly before directing staff to escort Jinho and Woo Jinshul to their rooms. But when he asked Jinwoo to stay back for a separate matter, the Korean hunter's expression immediately hardened. He wanted to know if this was about his father again. Adam reassured him that it wasn't. This had nothing to do with threats or danger. In fact, quite the opposite. The Bureau held him in the highest regard. Still unconvinced, Jinwoo pressed further, but Adam kept things vague, mentioning only that it was a top-secret matter they would discuss at the Bureau headquarters. During the drive, the tension in Adam's voice rose as he explained the ongoing internal problems. Christopher Reed's death, still hidden from the public, had left a gaping hole in the Bureau's strength. Resources were now being funneled toward finding someone capable of replacing him, and when Jinwoo asked whether he was one of the potential candidates, Adam gave a silent nod that said everything. Without dragging things further, Adam activated the center console, and a hologram came to life. Kamish's corpse appeared, towering and lifeless, alongside a glowing runestone, pulsing with power. Adam explained the runestone's origin and its unmatched potential. It had come from one of humanity's greatest calamities and had remained sealed until now, waiting for someone worthy. And in their eyes, Jinwoo was that someone. But Jinwoo didn't answer immediately. Instead, his focus shifted as he asked Adam to rewind the image, stopping at the hologram of Kamish's corpse. Jinwoo stared at it longer than Adam expected before asking if the body was truly stored intact. Adam hesitated before confirming that it had been preserved. Jinwoo, now firm in his tone, requested to see it. Caught off guard, Adam tried to explain that even he didn't know its exact location, that it was highly classified, but Jinwoo reminded him of all the time and cooperation he'd given the Bureau so far, implying this was hardly too much to ask. Adam, uncertain but aware of the weight behind Jinwoo's request, agreed and contacted the higher-ups for clearance to access Kamish's corpse. Soon, their car pulled into the Hunter Command Center, and word of Jinwoo's arrival quickly reached Director David Brennan. Surprised by the unplanned visit, David immediately questioned whether Jinwoo had said anything about the runestone, clearly expecting that to be the main agenda. But Adam explained that the topic had barely come up all day, which only deepened David's confusion. Why was Jinwoo so insistent on seeing Kamish's corpse? Perplexed, David stepped away to consult with the deputy director. As the two discussed behind closed doors, the deputy speculated on Jinwoo's intentions. While most hunters would have been drawn to the immense power runestones offered, especially one extracted from a creature like Kamish, Perhaps for Jinwoo, the corpse itself held greater value. David's brow furrowed as he recalled how Jinwoo's powers worked, how they were tied to the monsters he personally defeated. That was when it finally hit the deputy. His eyes widened in shock. Jinwoo wasn't there to marvel at Kamish. He was there to turn the mighty dragon into his summon. The realization struck hard, and David rose abruptly from his chair, stunned by the possibility. The idea of someone controlling a beast like Kamish was terrifying in itself. But before he could voice his opposition, the deputy reminded him of the political weight behind this interaction. Denying Jinwoo could shatter their delicate diplomatic ties, especially when their country already stood vulnerable after Christopher Reed's death. After a long silence, David finally relented. He decided to take responsibility himself and accompany Jinwoo to Kamish's chamber, reasoning that witnessing the act firsthand would be the best way to assess the risk. Together with Adam, he led Jinwoo into the elevator, descending into the heavily restricted sublevels beneath the command center. As they stepped out onto the underground floor, David gestured silently down the long corridor where a massive armored door waited at the far end. The moment they neared it, a chill clung to the air. Jinwoo felt it seep through his skin. The magical energy was dense, oppressive, almost sentient. His thoughts raced as he imagined the possibilities if Kamish were to become one of his shadow soldiers. When the door finally opened, Jinwoo was met with the sight he had come for. In the heart of a cavernous chamber lit by cold white lights, Kamish's body rested undisturbed. Towering and intact, its presence alone was enough to command silence. The dragon's scales shimmered faintly even in death, as if its power had refused to fade. David, trying to regain composure, explained how the corpse had been preserved exactly as it was after the raid that took the lives of hundreds of elite hunters. His words barely registered to Jinwoo, who had already started moving forward, eyes locked onto the giant carcass. Without waiting for further clearance, he calmly instructed David and the staff to stand back. When the deputy protested, unsure whether it was safe, David assured him that they had already given Jinwoo clearance, and now they would see for themselves what he intended. Standing in front of Kamish, Jinwoo raised his hand, the air around him beginning to distort. His voice, steady and quiet, carried a single word: arise. Dark energy erupted, flowing like liquid smoke toward the dragon's body. The chamber's lights flickered, but then came a sudden halt. A prompt flash before Jinwoo, informing him that the shadow extraction had failed. Jinwoo, however, didn't flinch. He had 2 more attempts. Reining in his power, he focused, ignoring the gasps from behind as the ground trembled again. The command left his lips once more. This time, the shadow responded. A deafening roar shook the chamber as Kamish's body twitched, then surged upward, the immense power coursing through its veins once again as it rose from death. Lights exploded overhead, while the structure groaned under the pressure of the awakening beast. Kamish stood, its shadow form towering over them all. The dragon's eyes scanned its surroundings before locking onto Jinwoo. Then, as if remembering something buried deep within, Kamish spoke, not with anger, but recognition. It addressed Jinwoo not as a stranger, but as the Shadow Monarch, the king of the dead. Panic broke out among the staff. Adam froze, disbelief etched across his face. David could barely breathe as he watched the scene unfold, while others staggered backward, unable to comprehend what was happening. Kamish's eyes drifted toward the humans, standing behind Jinwoo. Its voice dropped into a growl, and in the next moment, the chamber darkened under the weight of its murderous intent. A low snarl rippled from its throat as it vowed death upon every human in sight. The room shook violently, cracks splitting across the reinforced walls, barriers infused with top-ranker mana now splintering like glass under the weight of Kamish's fury. From a distance, David watched in terror as Kamish's mouth began to glow, the ominous light signaling the buildup of its most devastating attack, dragon breath. He braced himself as the chamber's integrity began to crumble, knowing full well they wouldn't survive what was coming. But before Kamish could unleash its wrath, Jinwoo's voice cut through the roar with absolute command. His tone was cold, authoritative, beyond negotiation. He reminded Kamish that the mana crystal embedded in its skull, the very source of its obedience to the rulers, was gone. The dragon froze. The glow faded. Its fury flickered, then dissolved. Adam could barely process what he was seeing. He asked, half to himself, whether Jinwoo had truly just spoken in the tongue of monsters. The deputy standing beside him was equally stunned by the sight before them. Kamish, once humanity's worst nightmare, now stood solemn before Jinwoo. The anger had faded from its eyes, replaced by something deeper: recognition. It spoke again, slower this time, with the calm acceptance of one who understood its new place. Once, it had served the king of dragons. Now, it knelt before Jinwoo, acknowledging him as its new sovereign. Jinwoo slowly approached the towering dragon and rested his hand gently on Kamish, his voice low as he asked whether Kamish had truly served the king of dragons. The dragon confirmed it had, revealing that it once followed the king of mad dragons, known as the monarch of destruction. As Jinwoo absorbed the weight of those words, his eyes lingered on the immense rage still radiating from Kamish. It stunned him to realize that, even as a summon, Kamish retained such a strong, independent will. He stood in silence, mind drifting back to the vision the system had once shown him, the 9 monarchs. There was the king of the dead, the shadow monarch, and the king of the giants, the monarch of the beginning. And now another piece of the puzzle fit into place. Kamish had once served yet another monarch, one whose power was rooted in destruction. But the moment of revelation didn't last. Kamish, its voice tinged with finality, told Jinwoo that their time together was short. Trapped in the abyss for too long, its magic was fading fast. As the dragon's form began to crumble, dust falling from its body like ash in the wind, it explained that 8 long years had drained it of all strength. Jinwoo's eyes widened in disbelief. Even with the powers of the Shadow Monarch, was he truly powerless against time? A desperate plea echoed within him as he called out to the system for help, but the system remained silent. Kamish's voice grew fainter, speaking its final thoughts with quiet resignation. It envied the shadow soldiers who could remain by Jinwoo's side forever. Then, with what little strength it had left, it offered a warning about 4 humans who had borrowed the power of the rulers and urged Jinwoo to be wary of them. Jinwoo remained still, watching helplessly as Kamish's massive frame slowly vanished, the mighty dragon reduced to particles of light, fading into the void. A notification soon appeared before him, stating that the shadow extraction had failed. Without a word, Jinwoo turned back and called out to Adam, telling him to inform Director David of his apologies and that he would personally cover any damages caused. The frustration gnawed at him as he walked away from the ruined lair. His clenched fist trembled with anger, and with a sudden burst of emotion, he struck the wall beside him. The force of the blow shook the building for a brief moment, leaving David and Adam frozen where they stood, stunned into silence. As Jinwoo emerged from the facility, Chief Woo Jinchul was already waiting outside, concern etched across his face. He mentioned they'd been trying to reach him for a while, but every attempt had failed. Jinwoo, still weary from everything that had transpired, simply said he'd been in a place where no calls could get through. Jinchul then asked if he had seen Jinho. The question caught Jinwoo off guard. He frowned, asking what Jinchul meant. Jinchul explained that Jinho had left hours ago after receiving a message, allegedly from Jinwoo, claiming he was waiting at the Hunter Bureau's headquarters. Jinwoo, visibly confused now, replied that he hadn't sent any such message and had just come from the Bureau himself. Jinho hadn't been there. Adam, who had caught part of the conversation, stepped in and confirmed that Jinho's name hadn't appeared in the visitor logs either. Jinchul nodded grimly, recalling that a hunter from the Scavenger Guild had come by to pick Jinho up 2 hours earlier. The air turned heavy with urgency as Adam quickly suggested contacting the Scavenger Guild directly. No time was wasted. He pulled out his phone and placed the call. Laura answered, and the moment Adam relayed what had happened, her face shifted. Her voice tightened as she asked if Jinwoo was aware. Adam admitted he didn't know the full details yet, only that Jinho was missing and they were actively searching. Laura didn't need to hear more. She understood the danger immediately and promised to find out what had happened as fast as possible. Adam turned back to update Jinwoo, but Jinwoo was already gone. Above the city rooftops, Jinwoo surged forward in great, bounding leaps, a blur of speed cutting across the skyline. Unease churned inside him like a storm. He cursed himself for being careless, for not assigning someone to guard Jinho. He should have been more cautious. The memory of the incident at Jinna's school resurfaced sharply in his mind, and the thought of history repeating itself made his chest tighten with dread. Without hesitation, he extended his hand and summoned his army. Shadows erupted beneath his feet, stretching outward like a black tide. Thousands of shadow soldiers swept through streets, alleys, and skies with a single purpose: to find Jinho. Jinwoo stood atop a towering skyscraper, the wind whipping against his coat as he scanned the city below with sharp, narrowed eyes. Worry crept behind the intensity in his gaze, a rare flicker of emotion breaking through his usual calm. His enhanced perception let him pick out every movement, every face in the streets far beneath him. Yet there was still no sign of Jinho. His thoughts ran wild. Maybe Jinho had left the city, but it didn't make sense. It wasn't like Jinho to vanish without a word. He was a combat-type D rank, not someone who would go down without a fight. And then there was that one name tying everything together: Scavenger Guild. Jinwoo's mind raced as the name Huang Dongsu resurfaced in his thoughts. The man had likely been waiting for this moment, predicting their arrival in America with eerie precision. Dongsu wanted answers. Answers about his brother's death. Jinho and he had been the only survivors of that dungeon. The memory of Jincho's old warning echoed in his mind like a prophecy fulfilled. He didn't regret what he did in that dungeon, but now, standing helpless above a city that offered no clues, he couldn't stop the burning thought. He should have assigned someone to protect Jinho. Meanwhile, tension grew inside the Scavenger Guild's headquarters. Thomas sat stiffly in his chair, his fingers laced as report after report brought no progress. His hunters had turned up nothing. He couldn't understand what Dongsu was thinking. As an S rank, Dongsu wasn't unaware of the power gap between himself and Jinwoo. Thomas realized that Dongsu's reckless actions could only mean one thing. He was counting on him to step in. Without waiting, he picked up his phone and rang Laura. Laura informed him that, with help from the Hunter Bureau, they'd traced Dongsu's movements over the last month and narrowed down 3 potential locations. Thomas didn't hesitate. He ordered full deployment. Every available guild member was to sweep those sites, and he would head out personally. But just before ending the call, something nagged at him. He asked how Laura had managed to get the Bureau to move so quickly. Her reply was simple, but heavy. She'd told them the truth, that if Dongsu wasn't found soon, it would come down to a clash between Thomas Andre and Sung Jinwoo. At the Hunter Bureau, the news hit like a shockwave. Adam relayed the update to the staff. Scavenger Guild had canceled all its scheduled raids. Every member had been mobilized. They were treating this like a crisis. The deputy director paused mid-step when he heard. The scale of the operation said everything. If the entire Scavenger Guild was moving, then Thomas Andre wasn't just aware. He was personally involved. This wasn't some internal dispute anymore. Something massive was unfolding, and the entire guild was racing to stop it before it reached the point of no return. The heart of the chaos lay inside a long-abandoned factory in the United States. Inside, Jinho lay unconscious on the cold concrete floor, bruised and bloodied, while a few men loomed over him. One among them, voice laced with uncertainty, questioned whether they were really okay with this. Dongsu, standing over Jinho with a look of disdain, dismissed the concern with a cold assurance that everything was under control. He wasn't planning to kill the kid, just get a few answers. He remembered Thomas's stern warning not to provoke Jinwoo, but Dongsu had never planned to confront Jinwoo directly. His sights had always been set on Jinho. He needed the truth, the one that haunted him, the confirmation that Jinwoo was the one who had killed his brother. That single truth would be enough to end it. Without waiting further, Dongsu slapped Jinho hard across the face in an attempt to wake him. When the blow didn't stir him, Dongsu's patience snapped. He drove his fist into Jinho's already bruised ribs. The force of it dragged a tortured scream from Jinho's throat, and blood spilled from his mouth as his eyes fluttered open, dazed and in pain. From the side, one of Dongsu's men watched silently, commenting almost clinically on Jinho's toughness, noting that an average man would have died from such abuse by now. Dongsu, clearly unimpressed by Jinho's endurance, clenched his fists with growing irritation. He was done playing nice. Grabbing Jinho by the hair, he slammed his head into the wall, the impact echoing through the empty building. Then, dragging him back upright, Dongsu leaned in close and muttered with quiet menace that while he had no intention of killing him just yet, he would keep torturing him and heal him each time he hovered on the edge of death, until he finally confessed. He reminded Jinho that this factory was deserted, that no one could hear him scream, and no one would be coming to save him. He then asked, voice dipped in mockery, whether the pain had finally loosened his tongue. Jinho, barely conscious and drenched in his own blood, was still defiant. With a pained groan, he lifted a trembling hand, raised his middle finger, and rasped a curse through split lips. Dongsu's rage erupted. He slammed Jinho's head into the wall once more, and this time, Jinho's body slumped to the ground, motionless, his strength drained, his will barely clinging to consciousness. From behind, the same worried subordinate stepped forward, his voice cautious as he reminded Dongsu to be careful, hinting at the mess they'd have to clean up if things went too far. Dongsu didn't even bother to look at him. He simply muttered that he hadn't even gotten started yet, his lips curling into a sinister smile that mirrored the cruelty of the brother he had lost. Just as he stepped forward to continue, something shifted in the dim light at the far end of the factory. Dongsu's eyes narrowed, catching sight of a high orc standing still in the shadows. Confused, he wondered if a dungeon break had happened nearby. But what unsettled him more was the orc's behavior. It wasn't snarling or attacking. The creature stood frozen, trembling in fear as it sensed an overwhelming presence rapidly approaching, and it wasn't Dongsu. Meanwhile, Dongsu didn't hesitate. He charged at the creature, ready to strike it down with a single blow. But before the blow could land, A deep voice cut through the stillness. Exchange. At the same time, on the other side of the world, Jinwoo's mother sat in the living room, her brows furrowed as she watched the television intently. The screen was flooded with breaking news, reports of strange, dangerous events cropping up across the globe. Her voice trembled slightly as she voiced her worries aloud, wondering if Jinwoo was doing all right in the midst of all the chaos. Beru, tasked with watching over Jinwoo's mother and Jinna, observed her with quiet reverence. From the shadows, he silently assured her, if there was anything their king couldn't overcome, then nothing in this world could. The broadcast shifted, cutting to live footage from a conference in the US. The camera briefly captured Jinwoo as he stepped onto the scene. Jinwoo's mother pointed toward the screen, calling Jinna's attention to it with a hint of pride in her voice. Beru's gaze also lingered on the screen, reverent and proud, but then, without warning, his entire body tensed. A cold shiver ran through him as a surge of dark, violent energy washed over his senses. He had felt this once before, the unmistakable sensation of Jinwoo's wrath. The king was angry, and it pierced through dimensions like a blade. Back in America, Thomas Andre, racing toward one of the suspected locations, suddenly froze in his seat. A feeling, deep and overwhelming, gripped his instincts. Without warning, he shouted for the car to stop, startling the driver. When hesitation met his command, Thomas roared again, this time with more force, and the sheer pressure in his voice left no room for delay. The car was still moving when Thomas slammed the door open with brute force. Without a second thought, he leaped out, the concrete beneath him shattering as he landed. He shouted back to the hunters still seated behind him, ordering them to catch up as fast as they could. Then, in a blur of motion and destruction, Thomas took off, cutting through the cityscape like a missile, driven by instinct and urgency. Meanwhile, inside the abandoned factory, everything changed in an instant. Out of nowhere, a fist crashed into Dongsu's stomach with devastating force. The impact lifted him off his feet, his body sailing across the factory before slamming into the far wall. Blood sprayed from his mouth as the shockwave rippled through the building. The men who had stood beside him blinked, trying to process what had just happened. On the cold floor, Jinho, barely holding on, managed a faint smile. Relief washed over his fading eyes as they locked onto the familiar figure now standing before him. The factory air grew thick and heavy, crackling with pressure. The presence now in the room was overwhelming, undeniable, and filled with pure, unfiltered rage. And there he stood, eyes blazing with fury. His gaze was locked onto Dongsu, not as a warning, but as a sentence. His arrival wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet and final, like death itself had stepped into the room. Jinwoo had arrived. He rushed to Jinho's side without hesitation, gently tilting his head and pouring a healing potion into his mouth. But almost immediately, a cold system notification flashed before Jinwoo's eyes. Healing potions couldn't restore health once it dropped below 10% of a person's total HP. The message was a cruel reminder. Jinho was too close to death. Frustration surged through him. Time was running out. Turning sharply to the two men nearby, Jinwoo's voice cut through the tension like a blade, cold and demanding, as he asked if either of them was a healer. The question wasn't a plea, it was an order. The one closest to him hesitated, clearly shaken, and then muttered something about not understanding Korean. Dongsu, having just pulled himself together from Jinwoo's earlier strike, seized the moment to speak up, casually translating the request to his men, as if this were just a routine introduction between acquaintances. Jinwoo didn't even spare him a glance. His gaze remained locked on the two men, his voice now even colder as he repeated his demand, this time laced with deadly intent. One of them, clearly the healer, let out a scoff and dared to smirk. With arrogant confidence, he said Jinwoo should convince his boss first before making requests of him. But before he could finish his sentence, Jinwoo flashed forward, grabbed the man's head, and slammed it into the nearby pillar with brutal force. Bone cracked, and the smirk disappeared beneath a spray of blood. Without pause, Jinwoo shifted to the second man, his patience now hanging by a thread. He asked again, this time with deadly clarity, if the man could heal. The man raised his hands, stammering an answer, but never got to finish it. A heavy force crashed his head into the concrete, silencing him instantly. Dongsu, now burning with rage, stepped forward, his voice seething as he demanded to know if Jinwoo had killed his brother. On the ground, Jinho stirred faintly. With great effort, he whispered Jinwoo's name, trying to warn him. But Jinwoo, in a calm voice, reassured him and told Jinho to rest and not speak. Dongsu didn't stop. He stepped closer, again demanding an answer. Jinwoo's eyes turned to ice as he finally responded, not with an admission, but with a chilling suggestion to go ask his brother himself. The words struck deep. Dongsu roared, his fist flying straight for Jinwoo's face. But Jinwoo was faster. He slipped past the punch and retaliated with a blow that sunk deep into Dongsu's gut. Dongsu coughed blood midair before crashing into a maze of iron pipes. The impact echoed with brutal finality. He tried to move, tried to rise, but before he could fully register what had happened, Jinwoo was already crouched low beside him, his presence like death itself. Dongsu howled and lunged, but Jinwoo's fist came down again, crushing his head into the pipes. But Jinwoo didn't stop there. His grip tightened around Dongsu's skull as he slammed it again and again, blood splattering with each impact. The brutal thuds echoed through the empty space, and Jinwoo remained locked in, hell-bent on crushing whatever resistance was left in Dongsu's broken body. Then, a deafening crash tore through the factory as the ceiling above exploded, and Thomas Andre landed with a quake. Dust and rubble rained around him as he rose from the crater, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. His voice rang out, calm yet commanding, as he demanded Jinwoo to stop. He reminded Dongsu of the warning he had once given him, not to touch Jinwoo. And now, seeing his guildmate battered and broken, he asked flatly if Dongsu was still alive. Jinwoo, still holding Dongsu by the head, replied coldly that he wasn't done yet. Thomas exhaled slowly and offered a way out. He stated that if Jinwoo released Dongsu, he would overlook what had occurred. Jinwoo's gaze turned sharp as he locked eyes with Thomas, his voice low and cold as he asked what would happen if he refused. Thomas bared his teeth, a growl in his tone, warning that the request was no longer open for negotiation. In a single, effortless motion, Jinwoo flung Dongsu's limp body aside. Dongsu crashed across the factory like a ragdoll, and as his broken form lay sprawled, his last flicker of consciousness burned with hatred. In his mind, Dongsu urged Thomas to kill Jinwoo in his place, his eyes seething with malice. He knew he had succeeded in pushing Thomas to intervene, the one who could finish what he himself could not. Jinwoo now stood facing the indomitable Thomas Andre, unshaken. No fear, no doubt, just quiet defiance. Thomas stepped forward, towering with power, his voice heavy with authority as he asked if Jinwoo truly understood who he was. Yet, Jinwoo's gaze remained icy and unwavering, silently asserting that he didn't care who Thomas was. It caught Thomas off guard. This wasn't ignorance. Jinwoo knew exactly who he was, and yet, he didn't care. That kind of fearlessness, it was something Thomas hadn't seen in years. Memories of his own rise surged within him. Born into poverty, raised as an outsider, he'd never been exceptional, until one day, the gift revealed itself. A terrifying talent for overwhelming violence. He sharpened it through endless fights, battles, and blood. Those who mocked him were silenced. Those who challenged him were crushed. And now, faced with a man who refused to bend, Thomas knew what had to be done. Time seemed to freeze as Thomas launched forward. His roar filled the air as his hand shot toward Jinwoo's skull, telling him to blame his ignorance for what was about to happen. Outside, the scavenger guild had finally arrived. Hunters moved to secure the perimeter until something massive came barreling at them like a missile. The ground quaked. Metal screeched. Something skidded across the floor and landed with brutal force at their feet. It was Thomas. Silence fell over the guild members. Eyes wide, breaths caught, their strongest, thrown like a rag doll. They rushed to his side, calling his name in panic, but Thomas raised a single hand, signaling them to stay back. His face was dark, his pride wounded deeper than his body. Without a word, he stormed back toward the factory, fury burning in every step. The vice guild master, stunned by the sight, snapped into action, yelling for everyone to prepare. The air was electric with tension. Inside, Jinwoo had already summoned Igris and Kaisel. Igris appeared beside him, cradling the barely breathing Jinho in his arms. Jinwoo immediately ordered his summons to rush Jinho to the nearest hospital, making sure they did everything they could to save him. Igris bowed deeply, mounted Kaisel, and the two vanished into the sky, streaking toward salvation. Back on the ground, scavengers full force poured into the factory. Dozens of elite hunters stood ready behind Thomas. But Jinwoo was not outnumbered. He raised a hand, and shadows erupted across the floor like smoke. One after another, the shadow army emerged. Knights, beasts, giants, forming an unstoppable tide of darkness. Across the battlefield, Thomas grinned. For the first time in a long while, he had found someone who didn't fear his strength. Someone who didn't kneel. This wasn't about Dongsu anymore. Now, all that mattered to him was reclaiming his pride, and the only way to do that was by killing Jinwoo right then and there. There was no going back now, and Thomas knew it well. That's why he offered Jinwoo one last chance, urging him to admit his mistakes, back off, and apologize. In return, he promised to spare his life. But Jinwoo only stood still, expression cold and unreadable, as he slowly raised his middle finger toward the world's strongest hunter. That was the final straw. Fury exploded through Thomas as Jinwoo's blatant disrespect shattered any restraint he had left. He growled that the man would regret not taking his last chance, voice trembling with rage as a violent energy burst around him. His shirt ripped apart, revealing a chiseled body as his muscles swelled, hardening like armor while a terrifying force surged beneath his feet. Behind both men, their forces gathered, locked and waiting. The moment commands were given, war erupted. The Scavenger Guild moved first, their front lines raising shields infused with mana, creating a shimmering defense. They formed a tight wall, bracing for impact, but Jinwoo's shadow army surged forward like a black tidal wave. Nearly 1,000 shadows collided with hundreds of top-tier hunters, the ground quaking with each impact as magic and brute force clashed. Thomas tore through the battlefield, his path cutting straight toward Tusk. The massive Shadow Mage raised his arms and summoned a thick barrier, but Thomas didn't slow. Slamming the ground, he launched himself skyward and came crashing down, shattering the magical wall and tearing Tusk's head clean off in one brutal strike. Hovering for a moment above the wreckage, Thomas sneered at the chaos below and mocked Jinwoo's forces before smashing down through the roof of a factory. Inside, the air was thick with violence. The Scavenger Guild was being overrun. Thomas saw his elite squad crumbling beneath the relentless tide of shadows. At the heart of it all stood Jinwoo, staring down at him not with fury, but with something colder, pity. Thomas charged forward without hesitation, but before he could reach his target, iron stepped into his path. The towering knight stood firm, yet was tossed aside like scrap as Thomas drove a fist through his shield and flung him across the room. His eyes snapped back to Jinwoo, only to find the man was gone. Then, with a flicker of black, Jinwoo appeared beside him and silently drove the Demon Monarch's dagger into his abdomen, but instead of cutting, the blade merely scraped along his hardened flesh. Jinwoo's eyes flicked with a hint of surprise. Thomas didn't waste the moment. He swung hard, and the punch landed flush, sending Jinwoo flying across the factory floor. Standing tall, Thomas spat that Jinwoo had made the mistake of looking down on a national-level hunter. Then, he raised a hand, and an invisible force gripped Jinwoo mid-air. With a voice devoid of mercy, he told him to feel the difference in strength, feel despair. But instead of struggling, Jinwoo responded with his own power. Ruler's authority exploded outward, slamming down on Thomas like a hammer and cracking the floor beneath him. He blinked in disbelief. Jinwoo wasn't resisting the pull, he was overpowering it. Jinwoo blurred forward, and his punch smashed into Thomas's face, blood spraying as the hunter staggered back. For the first time in his life, Thomas tasted his own blood. Jinwoo's voice cut through the tension as he rushed in again, mockingly asking what happened to all that talk about despair. Fists flew, and Thomas found himself being pushed back, struggling to keep up, shocked by the relentless precision behind every blow. He realized he had grossly underestimated this opponent. Blood dripping from his mouth, he snarled the single word, reinforcement. Jinwoo braced as Thomas transformed. His body swelled past 3 meters tall, now encased in golden armor, with black horns curling back from his head. His hair blazed like wildfire, his entire form pulsing with raw power. Jinwoo's thoughts raced back to Kamish's warning about 4 humans who had borrowed power from the rulers. As he watched Thomas, the meaning became clear. These were the national-level hunters with mystical powers, and Thomas Andre was unmistakably one of them. Even so, Jinwoo didn't falter. He launched forward, but Thomas slammed his fists into the ground, unleashing a shockwave that tore through the terrain and obliterated everything nearby. Jinwoo leaped back, narrowly avoiding blast just in time. Thomas created a gravitational zone next, pulling everything toward him in a deadly vortex. Jinwoo's shadows were dragged into the spiral, distorted and scattered, but the hunter pushed back with his own force, resisting the pull as Thomas built up mana above his head, shaping it into a massive energy sphere. He released it without warning. The blast carved out a massive crater, annihilating everything in its radius. Jinwoo landed just beyond the edge, crouching low as the air trembled. Thomas stood within the crater, panting, and warned coldly that he wouldn't miss next time. At the edge of the battlefield, the Vice Guild Master of Scavengers shouted for retreat, yelling at his team to get the wounded out and fall back. But Thomas charged again, ignoring it all. Jinwoo met him mid-air, his kick smashing into Thomas's head and hurling him across the ground. Thomas retaliated by activating another pull, but Jinwoo used Ruler's authority to accelerate, blasting toward him with explosive speed. Their fists collided in a deafening crash. Yet, despite Thomas's reinforced armor, it cracked, and the force of Jinwoo's punch sent him crashing through a factory wall, tearing through debris and steel. Jinwoo landed lightly, Calm and focused, Thomas emerged from the rubble, roaring with rage. He charged again, swinging his fist, but Jinwoo ducked beneath the attack and avoided the shockwave. In a blur, Jinwoo gripped Thomas by his horns and drove his knee into his face with devastating power, cracking more of the golden armor. Meanwhile, Hunter Bureau vehicles arrived and came to a screeching halt. Agents stood in stunned silence, the overwhelming magical pressure in the air paralyzing them. One figure crashed violently into the ground, and the earth trembled. Adam's face turned pale. He instantly recognized the wreckage and the man within it. It was Thomas Andre. No one could believe it. A national-level hunter was being beaten, overwhelmed by Sung Jinwoo. Thomas tried to rise again, but Jinwoo was already on him. His punches rained down like hammers. Every hit targeted weak points. Each blow pushed Thomas closer to collapse. Doubt and confusion seeped into Thomas's mind. How could a mage-type hunter have such speed, such raw power? This wasn't possible, but it was happening. Blood filled his mouth. Yet, pride wouldn't let him quit. With blood-stained teeth, Thomas clenched his jaw and roared that he was Thomas Andre, that this wouldn't be enough to bring him down. But Jinwoo didn't stop. He shifted behind him in a blink, elbowing him in the neck and driving the towering warrior into the ground again. His voice was cold, almost pitying, as he muttered that he didn't care who Thomas was. The Bureau agents and scavenger hunters stood frozen. None dared intervene. They could only watch, helpless, as their most powerful ally was being crushed. Adam finally ran toward them, shouting desperately for Jinwoo to stop, pleading with him to end it. But Jinwoo didn't pause. His attacks continued, relentless, precise. The upper armor of Thomas's body was now gone, and his torso was fully exposed. Blood dripped from his face. His strength waned, and just as Jinwoo wound up for one final devastating punch, Thomas, barely conscious, parted his lips. The words came slowly, weakly, but they were clear. He had admitted defeat. His body slumped. The fight drained from him, conceding that the battle was over. With that, Jinwoo halted, his clenched fist suspended for a moment, before he slowly lowered it, standing silently over the fallen Thomas. Onlookers were left speechless, struggling to comprehend the sight before them. Thomas Andre, one of the world's most powerful national-level hunters, lay broken on the ground, a symbol of overwhelming strength reduced to a battered figure. The image was especially jarring for Adam. How many hunters in the world could defeat Thomas Andre, he wondered. Was there ever anyone who could, to begin with? In all his years working for the Bureau, he had never seen anyone even come close. And now, watching the impossible unfold, the truth struck him like a thunderbolt. Once news of Thomas's defeat spread, it would shake the entire world to its core. Snapping back to reality, Adam wasted no time and called for the healers. One of the highest ranking among them rushed to Thomas's side, checking his vitals before immediately casting healing magic. His expression darkened as he assessed the damage. Thomas's body was wrecked beyond belief. Every bone shattered, blood flowing freely, his life hanging by a thread. Realizing his magic alone wouldn't be enough, the healer called out to the others. While the healers focused on their life or death struggle, Hunter Command Center staff swarmed the ruins of the factory, evacuating the wounded and surveying the damage. Amid the chaos, Adam stood quietly, watching it all unfold with a heavy heart. He reassured himself that, given the way things could have gone, this might have been the best possible outcome. But the devastation, the raw brutality of the battle, couldn't be ignored. Then an officer ran toward him, snapping him out of his thoughts. The man's face was pale, and his voice was grim as he reported the worst of it. S-rank hunter, Hwang Dong-soo wasn't breathing. Far from the wreckage, seated silently atop a tall building overlooking the Korean skyline, Jinwoo watched the city beneath him. He had used Shadow Exchange to return, swapping places with Beru, who remained behind in America, to heal Jinho to the best of his abilities. As his mind wandered through the echoes of battle, a deep, unfamiliar voice broke the silence, respectfully addressing him as king. Jinwoo turned his gaze toward the source and found a towering shadow soldier kneeling before him, the energy radiating off him, marking him as a knight-level commander. With his head bowed, the soldier humbly asked for a name. Jinwoo studied him for a moment, remembering the greed that had consumed the man in his final moments, and settled on the name, Greed, thinking it suited him well. As his gaze fixed on the familiar face beneath the shadows, he asked flatly whether Hwang Dong-soo liked his new name or not. The once proud S-rank hunter, now reborn as a part of the Shadow Army, bowed deeper and gave thanks for the name. Jinwoo's expression didn't change. He simply told him to return his head to the ground, bringing the conversation to a close. With that, he looked back over the cityscape of Korea. The battle was over, but the war, he knew, was only beginning. The next day, in the United States, the International Guild Conference finally commenced as Jinwoo arrived at the prestigious venue, escorted by the deputy director of the Hunters Bureau. Reporters swarmed the entrance, cameras flashing in rapid bursts. Jinwoo, clearly confused by the attention, asked about the commotion. The deputy director explained that the public had somehow caught wind of the fierce battle between him and Thomas Andre, and from this point on, it would be impossible to avoid the spotlight. He was now the central figure of the entire conference. He also reassured Jinwoo that the testimony from Dongsu's party had clarified the incident, and the truth would eventually surface with no blame falling on his shoulders. But Jinwoo wasn't focused on Dongsu anymore. The chaos and speculation didn't concern him. His purpose for coming to America was clear. Once his questions were answered, he had no intention of staying. When they arrived at the conference building, the deputy handed him an earpiece, assuring Jinwoo that he'd translate the presentation throughout the event. As Jinwoo stepped inside, the air shifted. Conversations died out, and all eyes turned toward him. Some of the hunters and officials studied him with curiosity, others with doubt, but a heavy mix of awe and unease hung in the air as they tried to grasp the power of the man who had just walked in. Whispers rose as Jinwoo made his way down the steps. Speculations buzzed from every corner about the man who had defeated the indomitable Thomas Andre. Some recalled his feat of clearing the S-rank gate in Tokyo, while others simply tried to make sense of his presence. Jinwoo ignored the murmurs and calmly took his seat as the conference began. A keynote speaker stepped onto the stage and introduced himself as Dr. Belzer before diving straight into the topic that had brought the world's top hunters and officials together. He stated that the number of gates appearing worldwide had surged, and with them, more powerful monsters had begun to emerge. Yet something else had occurred, an unusual activity detected high above the skies. Dr. Belzer explained that the magical energy concentration in the atmosphere had been increasing dramatically, a phenomenon they had named the Magosphere. Behind him, a world map lit up the screen, pinpointing the regions where this energy was densest. There were 9 major hotspots scattered across the globe, but one location stood out above the rest: South Korea. The moment Dr. Belzer mentioned it, all eyes shifted toward Jinwoo again. Murmurs grew louder, and tension rippled through the crowd. Still, Dr. Belzer attempted to ease their nerves, stating that if Jinwoo were indeed the cause of this phenomenon, then he would be far beyond the scope of any ordinary hunter. Jinwoo remained still, lost in thought. The number of locations matched the number of monarchs. Could this be connected? Dr. Belzer admitted that they still didn't know what caused the Magosphere, nor how to stop it. But whatever was coming, it would bring significant change to the world. They had to prepare. As the presentation wrapped up, the Bureau's director, David Brennan, took the stage for a pressing announcement. His voice was low and heavy with the weight of the news. Christopher Reed had been assassinated by a group of unknown assailants. The crowd fell into stunned silence. The idea that a hunter of Christopher's caliber could be killed sent a chill through the room. Speculation flared instantly. Who could possibly do this? More eyes turned toward Jinwoo, whispers connecting the dots between Thomas Andre's defeat and Christopher's death. Jinwoo remained impassive as David raised a hand to calm the speculation, urging the audience not to jump to conclusions. The Bureau had already identified a suspect, he announced. Jinwoo's gaze sharpened as an image flickered to life on the screen behind David. The man identified as Suspect S was believed to be responsible for the murder of Christopher Reed. The audience stared at the image, confused. It wasn't Jinwoo, but the resemblance was uncanny. Too close. Too precise. Meanwhile, Jinwoo clenched his jaw in frustration, questioning his father's motives. As his thoughts raced, he recalled something crucial. Dungeons were the domain of the rulers, a fact now tangled with his father's sudden reappearance. He remembered what Kamish had told him, about 4 humans who had once borrowed the ruler's strength. The words echoed in his mind as he pondered the possibility. Why would a ruler send someone who looked like his father? Could this truly be connected to what Kamish had said? David pressed on, revealing that the suspect had been caught on camera months ago during a devastating incident with Hwang Dong-soo that reduced an entire section of the Bureau's headquarters to flames. Footage began playing. On screen, Suspect S stood over Dong-soo's unconscious form. Jinwoo's soldier, Greed, gave him a silent confirmation. There was no doubt. The man in the footage was his father. David explained that the association would request the aid of all guilds to locate and apprehend the suspect. If any sightings occurred, they were to be reported immediately. The questions came flooding in. One hunter asked whether there was proof that Suspect S wasn't human. David confirmed that his magical signature matched that of a monster. Then came a delicate question. Why wasn't the identity of Suspect S being shared with the public? David paused before answering. The suspect, he said, was connected to one of the hunters in the room. For now, the association had decided to keep his identity confidential. A hand went up from the back row. Liu Zhigang, China's 7-star hunter and a national-level powerhouse, stood and asked directly, what was the nature of Suspect S's connection to Hunter Sung Jinwoo? David hesitated. Then, finally, he said it. He revealed that during the interrogation, Suspect S had claimed to be Jinwoo's father. The Bureau had no reason to doubt the claim and was treating the investigation accordingly. The room erupted in gasps. Shock rolled through the audience in waves. Liu Zhigang turned to Jinwoo and asked the question everyone else was afraid to voice. If Suspect S truly was his father, what would Jinwoo do if the world's hunters tried to bring him down? Jinwoo's answer came without hesitation. He calmly replied that if Suspect S truly was a monster, then it was only natural for hunters to hunt monsters, and if that were the case, he would personally take him down himself. But if the suspect was truly his father and not a monster, then Jinwoo, eyes cold and burning with silent menace, made his vow clear. He would protect his family and wouldn't hesitate to hunt down those hunters, even if it meant becoming the enemy of every single one in the world. As the International Guild Conference drew to a close, Jinwoo stepped out of the building, only to be greeted by Adam White waiting outside. With a slightly cautious tone, Adam asked if Jinwoo had truly meant what he said back in the meeting. Without a hint of hesitation, Jinwoo nodded and confirmed he did. Adam let out a soft chuckle, half in awe and half in disbelief, and remarked that there were only 2 hunters in the entire world who would dare to say something like that in front of so many powerful hunters. With a faintly embarrassed smile, Adam gestured vaguely and said the other person was currently lying in a hospital bed. Jinwoo immediately understood, the image of a broken but defiant Thomas Andre flashing in his mind. Trying to shift the mood, Adam suggested Jinwoo join the banquet hosted by the Hunters Association, but Jinwoo's attention drifted as he noticed a presence approaching, the heavy, commanding aura of Liu Zhigang, accompanied by a small group of subordinates. The atmosphere instantly shifted, conversations died down, and every eye in the vicinity turned to the approaching Chinese hunter. Liu stepped forward and said something in Mandarin, his tone calm but resolute. Jinwoo turned slightly, his expression calm, and asked Adam what the man had said. Adam listened for a moment and then explained that Liu claimed to have caught a giant monster on the coast of China, one that Jinwoo had supposedly allowed to escape. Jinwoo remained silent as Liu continued speaking. Adam translated as fast as he could, explaining that Liu had been caught off guard by the monster's power. The battle had been especially difficult, taking place on the open sea. Liu had always wondered what kind of hunter could deal with such monsters so easily, and now, standing in front of Jinwoo, he finally had his answer. Then Liu extended a hand, offering a firm handshake. He said he had wanted to meet Jinwoo for a while now. He added that he was glad Thomas Andre had been put in his place, and he had no doubt Thomas had been in the wrong. Jinwoo looked at him with new eyes. His initial impression had been that Liu Zhigang was just a grumpy man with a stiff attitude, but now, listening to his words, he found him far more intriguing. The 2 hunters shook hands firmly. Just as Liu was about to leave, he paused and uttered one last sentence in Mandarin. Adam's eyes narrowed slightly as he translated, his voice just a little more hushed. Liu had said he hoped Suspect S wasn't someone related to Jinwoo's family. Once again, silence fell around them. The air grew heavy under the weight of that final remark as Liu Zhigang and his team quietly left the event behind. Adam reassured Jinwoo that Liu Zhigang didn't seem to harbor any ill intent, adding that the Chinese hunter had even said he never wanted to fight him. Jinwoo remained calm, nodding slightly, and replied that it was all right, showing no trace of concern. Moments later, David Brennan entered the room and gestured for Jinwoo to follow him. As they walked down a quiet corridor toward a private meeting room, Jinwoo's eyes narrowed slightly in surprise. Inside the room, he found Norma Sellner seated on the sofa. He hadn't expected to see her again. Without masking his curiosity, Jinwoo asked what business Miss Sellner had with him. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of unease as she explained that she had been having recurring dreams, visions in which top hunters were being hunted down by someone. The disturbing part, she added, was that each time she had one of those dreams, the event would come true only a few days later. The weight of her words settled heavily. Jinwoo's voice dropped as he asked whether Christopher Reed had been among them. David nodded and confirmed that they had indeed warned Christopher about the danger, but he hadn't listened, and they all knew how that had ended. With concern tightening her features, Miss Sellner continued, saying that the hunters who had been pillars of strength in this world, the ones humanity had relied on, were going to keep dying. The force hunting them would not stop until they were all eliminated. Jinwoo's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the implications. He asked if Miss Sellner was here to warn him of the same fate, but she shook her head. That wasn't her reason. She hadn't come to warn him. She had come to ask for his help. For the first time, Confusion stirred beneath Jinwoo's composed exterior. Miss Selner explained that she wanted him to protect the remaining hunters who were still alive. She tried remembering the faces of the culprits from her dreams, but no matter how hard she tried, the memories slipped away. So, she said, she had decided to take a different approach, one that involved using her ability within the dream itself to identify them. Jinwoo recalled their last encounter and finally understood why she had looked into his eyes so intently back then. She had been searching for something. Her voice trembled as she recounted what happened that day. There had been a voice, an entity speaking to her from within Jinwoo. When Jinwoo asked what that voice had said, she lowered her gaze, visibly shaken, and replied that it had told her to go back and prepare for war. The words struck Jinwoo like a blade of ice. His mind began racing. He remembered the King of Giants' warnings about the battle between the rulers and the monarchs. Could these hunters' deaths be part of that larger conflict? Still trying to put the pieces together, Jinwoo asked why she had chosen him specifically to protect the others. Miss Selner didn't hesitate. She had seen a power within him, the same overwhelming energy that had appeared in her dreams. Jinwoo instantly realized what she meant. It was the power of the Shadow Monarch. If she had sensed the same presence in the hunters' killers, then those attackers must be monarchs as well. David's voice broke in, explaining that the threat they faced was far beyond anything normal hunters could handle. These beings were on a different level entirely, and they needed someone like Jinwoo, someone powerful enough to stop them. He added that the Bureau was willing to offer anything in return for Jinwoo's help, even the runestone left behind by the dragon Kamish. David's voice grew more serious as he stressed that the hunters in question weren't just powerful, they were essential. They were the last barrier protecting humanity. If they fell, there would be nothing left to stop future catastrophes. Jinwoo sat quietly for a long moment, weighing it all. Then, with firm resolve, he declined the offer. David stared in disbelief. Shocked, he asked whether Jinwoo's rejection was because of some lingering resentment toward Thomas Andre after their clash, but Jinwoo made it clear that wasn't the reason. The truth was simpler, and far more important. He still didn't know who the real enemy was. Until he understood that, he couldn't commit to anything. Rising from his seat, Jinwoo turned toward the door, but just as he reached it, he paused. Something pulled at him. Without turning, he called out for Adam White. When Adam approached, Jinwoo asked him to provide the list of hunters the Bureau wanted him to protect, and then, almost as an afterthought, he asked Adam to arrange a meeting with them. Adam's eyes lit up, clearly relieved and more than a little excited. He nodded eagerly, already preparing to set things in motion. The final day of the International Guild Conference had arrived, and the banquet hall brimmed with the presence of the world's strongest hunters and their entourages. Amid the grand celebration, Jinwoo stood beside Jinho, who had finally returned from the hospital. When Jinwoo asked about his condition, Jinho, his eyes misty with emotion, replied that he felt better than ever. He confessed that he had been deeply moved upon learning Jinwoo had fought Thomas Andre, the Goliath, himself all for his sake. Nearby hunters watched them from a distance, speaking in hushed tones as they observed Jinwoo with awe. Despite being right in front of them, his presence was completely undetectable. To them, Jinwoo wasn't just powerful, he was on a level they couldn't even fathom. A man soon approached, introducing himself as the CEO of a global firm dealing in monster remains. With a businesslike smile, he expressed interest in purchasing the bodies of the giants Jinwoo had hunted and asked if he had time to talk. Jinwoo responded coolly that he didn't handle business affairs himself, then nodded toward Jinho, saying the vice chairman of the Ajin Guild oversaw those matters. The two men stepped aside to talk, and Jinwoo watched them go with quiet pride, pleased to see Jinho growing into his role. Before long, Adam arrived at the banquet, holding a tablet in hand. He handed it to Jinwoo and explained that it contained the names of the top 10 hunters ranked by points, a system based on contribution, mission success, and activity. These individuals, he added, were considered priority targets, and if Jinwoo chose to help, the Bureau would likely ask him to protect them. Jinwoo asked where he ranked on the list. Adam chuckled and answered that he was likely in 3rd or 4th place, mostly due to his performance against the Giants. Thomas Andre topped the list, followed by Liu Zhigang, then Christopher Reed and Siddharth. Jinwoo skimmed the list briefly, already finding it tiresome to commit the names to memory. Instead, he silently dispatched shadow soldiers to each hunter. Through them, he could stay aware of their conditions and potentially communicate with the rulers, making it easier to discern friend from foe in the coming conflict. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of slow, heavy footsteps. A familiar pressure filled the room as an overwhelming aura approached. Jinchul, standing nearby, leaned in slightly and tried to speak, but Jinwoo cut him off calmly, assuring him that it wasn't something he needed to worry about. Then, Thomas Andre stepped into view. One arm was encased in a cast, a clear reminder of their previous battle. He walked up to Jinwoo, eyes steady, and explained that despite the efforts of doctors and healers, his arm still hadn't fully recovered. Jinwoo's magic power had done too much damage. While healing was underway, it was progressing slowly. Thomas paused, reflecting aloud on the battle. He admitted that Jinwoo could have easily wiped out his entire guild that day, and yet, no one had died, except Huang Dongsu, who had brought it upon himself. He then asked why Jinwoo had chosen to show such restraint. Jinwoo's response was simple. He said that Thomas's guild had committed no crime worthy of death. That explanation seemed to satisfy the Goliath, who nodded with a mix of understanding and respect. He stated his intention to hold a grand funeral for Dongsu, not to excuse his actions, but to honor him in death. As he turned to leave, Thomas made a final request. Once his arm was fully healed, he hoped they could share a meal together. He asked Jinwoo to leave his contact details with his manager so they could arrange it. Laura stepped forward then, politely requesting Jinwoo's information, explaining that Thomas also wished to send a gift in appreciation. Jinwoo initially declined, saying there was nothing he needed, but Laura gently insisted. Her master, she said, was a competitive man who disliked owing anyone favors. Even something small would ease his mind. After a short pause, Jinwoo relented, suggesting that a good dagger would do. Laura smiled at the request, thanked him, and followed after Thomas. Once she was gone, Adam reappeared and suggested they begin introductions with the hunters on the list, but Jinwoo shook his head, saying there was no need anymore. His eyes flicked over the list as he asked about the 6th-ranked hunter, noting that the name was conspicuously absent. Adam looked momentarily taken aback. He admitted that the Bureau had lost contact with the hunter just days before the conference. Even the Brazilian government and their secret agencies hadn't been able to track him down. Jinwoo's expression darkened. There was a chance that the hunter had already been eliminated. With Thomas Andre and Christopher Reed no longer part of the equation and one hunter missing, that left 7 names. 7 more he needed to cast his shadow on. The party was still in full swing in America, while night had already draped Korea in quiet darkness. Inside the Korean Hunter Association, President Go sat alone at his desk, the soft rustle of paperwork the only sound in the room. Yet it wasn't the documents or late hours that weighed on him. It was something deeper, heavier. His heart, for some time now, had refused to beat normally. It had begun years ago, a subtle discomfort that had only grown more persistent. Recently, the unease had become impossible to ignore. His heart pounded with unnatural force, not from exertion, but as if sounding an alarm that his end could be near. A quiet scoff escaped his lips. The doctors had told him this would happen if he kept pushing himself. Yet, he had ignored their warnings, fully aware he'd long since crossed those limits, and it was nothing short of a miracle that he was still standing. Then, the shrill ring of a phone pierced the silence. He reached for it without hesitation. On the other end was the gentle voice of his wife, soft with concern, asking if he was all right. Her words, though brief, brought a rare comfort. He leaned back in his chair and assured her that he was just finishing up and would be home soon. But midway through his reply, a bizarre and eerie sensation suddenly pulled at his attention. Something felt off. He turned his eyes toward the window, and what he saw froze him in place. The skyline, the traffic, the lights, everything had been swallowed by an oppressive black void. Panic began to creep in as he struggled to make sense of what was happening. But then, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision made him stop cold. He turned. There, seated on the couch as if he owned the room, was a man he had never seen before. He sat casually, a faint grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Cold air seemed to radiate from him, the kind that didn't belong to this world. The Frost Monarch had arrived. The tension was thick inside the Hunter Association, as Silid, the Frost Monarch, sat with eerie ease across from President Go, whose mind scrambled to make sense of the intruder's sudden presence. Something about the creature twisted his instincts, something ancient and wrong. He couldn't understand how he had failed to sense such a dangerous aura. The aura now swelling around the creature made it clear. He was no ordinary intruder. President Go couldn't face this alone. As his mind raced, Silid's voice, cold and calm, broke through the silence. He informed the chairman that the office had already been severed from the outside world. That declaration rattled President Go. It felt surreal, like a dream slipping into nightmare. But before he could fully grasp that thought, something sharp and fast sliced past his left shoulder. A searing chill followed. He looked down to see frost forming rapidly, a jagged trail of ice spreading across his suit where the projectile had grazed him. Pain bloomed beneath the surface as Silid, without shifting tone, commented on the wound and wondered aloud if the chairman still believed he was dreaming. Now, fully alert, President Go steadied his voice and demanded to know who the figure was. But Silid merely frowned at the question, his tone tinged with disappointment as he remarked that he had hoped President Go would recognize him without the need for introductions. Confusion still clouded the chairman's thoughts, but Silid continued, his words sharp and dismissive. He called President Go a fragment of brilliant light, urging him to reveal his true self. Then, almost mockingly, he added that perhaps the fragment was simply afraid, that the vessel might crumble beneath the weight of its own power. With no reaction from President Go, Silid seemed to lose interest in conversation. His eyes narrowed, and without hesitation, he unleashed a devastating burst of icy magic. The explosion rippled through the office, shaking the walls and filling the room with a thick white fog that cloaked everything in sight. But in that freezing haze, Silid smiled as two radiant lights shone through, piercing, golden eyes burning with power. The fragment of brilliant light had finally awakened. Silid didn't waste a second. Another blast followed, more precise and lethal, aimed straight at the heart. But this time, President Go moved. His arm swung with divine force, deflecting the attack and sending it crashing into the wall. The explosion shattered stone and steel, revealing an endless void beyond. As the fog slowly cleared, President Go stepped forward, his body now cloaked in a luminous golden aura, pulsing with divine energy. This wasn't the Hunter Association chairman anymore. This was the brightest fragment of brilliant light in full form. The Frost Monarch's gaze sharpened. With a grim grin, he admitted that he had searched for this power for a long time, never realizing it had been hiding in what he now called a broken vessel. His tone shifted as he revealed that all 7 fragments of brilliant light had already been located, and that 2 had already been destroyed. His goal now was simple: to witness the proud humiliation on the brightest fragment's face before killing him. But President Go didn't flinch. His roar echoed with defiance, daring the Frost Monarch to prove he could bring him down. Silid chuckled darkly, amused that a fragment, clinging to a fading body, dared to challenge a monarch who had long since conquered his own vessel. He scoffed at the idea, wondering aloud if President Go could even land a single hit. Then, the monarch raised his arms. With a thunderous screech, a massive wall of jagged ice surged forward like a wave of death. President Go dodged at the last moment. The ice tore through the space he had just occupied, and with clenched fists, he retaliated. A golden punch crashed into the wall of frost, shattering it into frozen shards that rained down like hail. Without missing a beat, he charged and aimed a devastating strike at Silid, but the monarch danced away effortlessly, countering with a spear of ice that sliced across President Go's shoulder. Blood bloomed. The chairman staggered. Silid, confident, let his guard slip for a split second, and President Go saw it. He lunged forward, driving a punch toward the opening, but Silid was too quick. An ice barrier formed in an instant, absorbing the blow. Still, President Go didn't stop. He attacked again and again, pressing forward, trying to find even the smallest weakness. But Silid moved like mist, untouchable, and the chamber rang with the sound of their clash. Magic exploded with every collision, shaking the structure from within. President Go's breaths grew heavier. His movements slowed. His body screamed with every step. He was running out of time. With desperation mounting, he pushed himself into one last charge. A golden punch flashed forward, blazing with everything he had left, but Silid simply stepped back, avoiding the strike with ease. The chairman clenched his teeth in frustration. The truth hit him like a hammer. His vessel was breaking. His strength was nearly gone. Silid stood tall and untouched. His gaze, once curious, now held something colder: pity. The monarch vanished from sight and reappeared an instant later right before him. President Go's eyes barely registered the movement before the spear tore through his chest. Agonizing pain erupted through his body. Blood poured from his mouth as he stumbled, barely remaining upright. Silid loomed over him, grinning, watching the fragment crumble. He spoke calmly, almost amused, wondering how long it would take to find a new vessel. But by the time that happened, he said, the monarchs would already have gathered. This world would fall long before the fragment could return. President Go coughed, blood dripping down his chin, but a laugh still escaped his lips. Low and ragged, he gripped the spear with one hand and spoke through the pain, saying he hadn't fought in vain. The Frost Monarch had missed something. Just as the fragments had failed to anticipate his actions, Silid too overlooked what truly mattered. The monarch's eyes narrowed, sensing something, powerful and wrong. Then, without warning, a colossal burst of mana roared past his face. The explosion behind him rocked the dimension itself, shattering part of the enclosed space. Silid turned toward the chairman with a bitter grin, asking if that was the surprise he had been buying time for. But President Go only smiled through the blood, calm and certain. What needed to happen had already begun. A quiet rumble followed, and then a deafening crash. The mana barrier Scyld had crafted around the office shattered into pieces, crumbling like glass. Confusion flashed across the monarch's face as he muttered that a broken barrier wouldn't change the outcome. But President Go wasn't done. With the last of his strength, he let out a cry. From beneath him, the shadows shifted, and a figure surged forth. In a blur, an ant-shaped creature darted forward as it leapt through the shattered wall with an ear-piercing scream. Scyld's gaze snapped to it, momentarily stunned, but he brushed it off as just another foot soldier from the abyss. It didn't matter. Or so he believed, until a chilling realization hit him, freezing his expression. This wasn't just any soldier. His eyes widened in horror. He had made a grave mistake. Panic struck as he flung President Go's body aside and launched himself after the ant. A sickle of frost materialized in his hand, ready to strike the creature down before it could escape. He reached it in a flash and swung the blade, but the sickle never connected. A hand caught it mid-air, fingers closing around the blade with bone-crushing force. The monarch's eyes widened as time seemed to stop. That wasn't the ant anymore. Standing before him, gripping the sickle like it was nothing, was a figure cloaked in shadows. It was Jinwu. His cold, piercing eyes locked onto the frost monarch as he grabbed Scyld by the throat, demanding to know his true identity. The frost monarch's heart sank as he grasped for breath, but even in this weakened state, he sensed the monstrous shadow army looming behind Jinwu. His gaze narrowed with sudden wariness. He muttered under his breath, referring to Jinwu as the shadow monarch, then questioned why, even after amassing such a vast army, he hadn't reached out to the other monarchs sooner. Jinwu's confusion was plain in his eyes, and in that instant, Scyld finally understood what President Go had meant during their fight. He realized with growing dread that Jinwu was the crucial piece he had overlooked. A surge of cold energy rapidly formed in his mouth, and with desperation gripping him, Scyld released a devastating blast of freezing air. Jinwu's instincts kicked in. He shot backward just in time, narrowly avoiding the attack as an enormous ice wall erupted ahead of him. The sheer pressure of the magic confirmed what he already suspected. This being wasn't just a monarch, but a dangerously adept magic user. Without wasting a breath, Jinwu summoned his demon monarch daggers. The twin blades gleamed with ominous light as he lunged forward, shattering the ice wall with a single, precise strike. But just as he prepared to strike again, Scyld raised his hands, not in defense, but in surrender, and unexpectedly suggested ending the fight. The Frost Monarch claimed he hadn't come to risk his life in a battle to the death. Scyld's cold gaze shifted toward the crumpled form behind Jinwu. At that moment, realization struck. The chairman. Jinwu turned his head. Blood-coated President Go's motionless body. The man was barely clinging to life. Then, without a word, Scyld conjured an enormous spear of jagged ice. He launched it straight toward the helpless chairman, presenting Jinwu with a cruel ultimatum. Jinwu's eyes blazed as he immediately activated Ruler's authority, his mind screaming for the attack to stop, but a notification interrupted him. The Frost Monarch's magic resisted his command. His fury exploded. Slamming his foot into the ground, Jinwu shot forward with all his speed, cutting through the air toward President Go. The ice spear shrieked as it neared its target. In one final surge, Jinwu reached the chairman's side and intercepted the spear mid-flight, deflecting it with a resounding clash of metal and frost. The deadly weapon veered away, embedding itself into a marble pillar. He had saved him, for now. But Jinwu's rage was now fully ignited, his glare locked onto the Frost Monarch, who stood there, watching with infuriating calm. Before he could retaliate, Scyld summoned a swirling portal behind him and turned to flee. Jinwu wouldn't let him escape unscathed. He called forth a barrage of daggers from his inventory and hurled them in a deadly flurry. One dagger hit true, sinking deep into Scyld's shoulder. The monarch's body tensed with pain, his expression twisted as he clenched his teeth, fury boiling just beneath the surface. Yet he didn't attack. He stepped toward the gate, declaring coldly that he would return, once Jinwu's shadows opened again, and with one final venomous taunt, he gestured toward the dying chairman, calling him Jinwu's parting gift, a corpse soon to join his army. The words pierced deeper than the spear ever could, but before Jinwu could move again, the monarch vanished into the shrinking portal. The room fell into an unnatural silence. The magical barrier was gone, and Jinwu cursed himself for not sensing the threat sooner. He turned and rushed to President Go's side. The chairman lay still, his body soaked in blood. Jinwu knelt beside him, heart racing. This wasn't something a potion could heal. Without hesitation, he called for his most trusted summon. Beru heard the call and tore through space like a bolt of lightning. He dropped to one knee before Jinwu, awaiting orders. Jinwu's voice was low, tight with urgency. Beru was to do everything in his power to save him. The loyal summon placed his clawed hands over the chairman's chest and channeled his full magical strength. Healing light surged, but nothing changed. Jinwoo's jaw tightened. From his inventory, he drew a small vial, the holy water of life, the last resort. He leaned forward, ready to administer it, until a trembling hand rose and clutched his wrist. President Go's eyes fluttered open, barely. His voice was hoarse and broken as he whispered for Jinwoo to stop. It was already too late. Jinwoo froze, wanting to resist, to argue, but the look in the chairman's eyes left no room for protest. Labored breath, the chairman offered words of gratitude. Jinwoo had arrived, and that alone was enough. Blood spilled from his lips as he spoke of the supreme being, of revelations from the other side, and a battle on the horizon unlike any that had come before. There were things Jinwoo needed to understand, warnings he had to hear. Jinwoo held his breath, trying to memorize every word as the life drained from the man before him. The chairman's hand trembled as he squeezed Jinwoo's, warning that a time would come when he'd have to make a critical choice about which side to stand on, and pleaded with him to stay with humanity, no matter what. President Go's voice cracked as he confessed his longing to fight alongside the younger generation, to protect the world with them. But his body had failed him. Still, he had no regrets. Meeting Jinwoo had given him peace, and as his breath slowed, he spoke one last truth. His heart, weak and faltering, had endured all this time just for this moment, just to see Jinwoo with his own eyes. At last, his hand slipped from Jinwoo's grasp, falling to the floor with a soft, final thud. It was over. Jinwoo remained still, lips pressed in a tight line, eyes fixed on the lifeless face of a man he had respected. Beru said nothing, head bowed low beside him, and outside, beyond the broken glass, the sky broke open. Rain began to fall, soft, unending, and mournful, as if the heavens themselves had paused to mourn a life now lost. The cold autumn wind whispered through the falling rain as headlines lit up screens across the globe. Brazil's great hunter Jonas had been found lifeless in a river. The chairman of the Korean Hunters Association had been brutally murdered, stabbed through the heart. And just like that, the names of Christopher Reed, Jonas, and Go Gun-hee, once revered as the world's mightiest protectors, were now written among the dead. Panic swept through the nations. News outlets looped grim footage and desperate commentary. Even the U.S. Hunter Association stepped forward with a statement, but no words could soothe the rising dread. Humanity had always looked to hunters for salvation, but now the world was forced to ask the terrifying question, who protects the hunters? The rain poured with no intention of letting up as mourners gathered beneath black umbrellas for President Go's funeral. The sky mourned with them, a heavy downpour that dulled the color from the world. Jinwoo stood still, gaze fixed downward, unmoving. His eyes eventually drifted to the side, where Chief Wu Jinchul stood just a few steps away. The man looked hollowed out, every trace of sharp discipline in his appearance gone. His eyes were sunken with grief, and his shoulders sagged beneath an invisible weight. With a voice choked by loss, Jinchul questioned why it had been impossible to save the chairman, even with all of Jinwoo's power. Jinwoo's response came low, heavy with regret. It had already been too late when he arrived. No further words came. Jinchul lifted his head slightly, letting the rain strike his face as he stared into the gray heavens. Just yesterday, the chairman had asked him about his trip to the U.S., had told him to return quickly. And now, just like that, he was gone. A life snatched away before he could even say goodbye. The chief turned back and thanked Jinwoo for being with the chairman in his final moments, but Jinwoo didn't speak. He couldn't. There was only the cold simmering in his chest, an oath forged in silence. He would find the one responsible, no matter the cost. As the rain intensified, Jinwoo made his decision. He turned toward Jinchul, voice clear beneath the sound of falling water, and instructed him to gather the reporters. It happened fast. The press conference was organized within the hour, and the room quickly swelled with eager voices and flashing cameras. When Jinwoo entered, the chatter died instantly. His presence alone silenced the room. Every lens locked onto him. He spoke plainly, but his words hit with force. There existed now a colony of monsters, intelligent, cunning, and far stronger than anything humanity had seen. These beings didn't attack openly. They isolated their targets, deploying magic that severed space, preventing escape and reinforcement. A reporter, unable to hold back, asked if the creature that had killed President Go was among them. Jinwoo's eyes didn't flinch. He confirmed it. The one responsible was part of that same colony. He continued, issuing a warning to every hunter around the world. Anyone who felt they might be targeted needed to stay close to their comrades. To fight alone was to invite death. But behind his words, Jinwoo's thoughts wandered back to the creature's final words, the name it had given itself, the Monarch of Frost. And if that was true, then there were others. The monarch of the beginning, and even Jinwoo himself, the monarch of the shadows. These were beings whose strength eclipsed even the greatest hunters alive. No one else could face them. As the silence in the room deepened, Jinwoo closed with one final statement. For those without comrades, for those who felt alone and vulnerable, they should reach out to him. Through the Korean Hunters Association, he would protect them. The Battle of Monarchs had begun, and the world would never be the same. In a cold, dimly lit cave, deep beneath the earth, the air was thick with unease as 5 monarchs gathered in silence. Their presence warped the space around them, a suffocating pressure building as Sillid, the Frost Monarch, finally broke it. The others turned toward him as he spoke with chilling certainty. The Shadow Monarch was alive, and he was walking the surface of Earth. Yogamont, the Transfiguration Monarch, narrowed his eyes, his voice laced with doubt, as he muttered that it was impossible. No vessel could contain the true power of the Shadow Monarch. Even the Dragon King couldn't maintain his form on Earth, so how could this be? But Sillid's expression didn't waver. He said he'd seen it himself. The Shadow Monarch was alive, real, and more dangerous than the fragment of brilliant light they had once feared. The atmosphere thickened. None of them wanted to believe it, yet none could challenge the certainty in Sillid's words. Sillid continued, proposing what none had dared to voice. They should attack the Shadow Monarch now, while he was still in human form. It was their only chance. He asked for their support, his voice hardening with resolve. Tarnak, the monarch of the Iron Body, scoffed and dismissed the idea outright, reminding Sillid that picking a fight with one of the strongest among the 9 monarchs wasn't bravery, it was suicide. He urged patience, insisting they wait for the return of the Dragon King, the monarch of destruction. Sillid's eyes flashed as pain flared through his wounded shoulder, his fists tightening. Waiting wasn't an option. They were monarchs, not servants hiding behind another's strength. If they didn't act now, they never would. The human vessel was a flaw, one that could be exploited. But Tarnak didn't flinch. He reminded them what had happened to the monarch of White Flames. The Shadow Monarch had bound him with a single command, turning his eternal form into a silent slave. Tarnak refused to suffer the same fate. Yogamont agreed, his tone cool and distant. He didn't want to gamble his existence just to fall like the others. The risk wasn't worth it. Raken, the monarch of beasts, growled in frustration, branding them cowards. He refused to believe that even the Shadow Monarch's authority could bend true monarchs in their original forms into his servants. Tarnak turned to Raken, his voice sharp, reminding him that the Shadow Monarch and the Administrator were now working together. That alone made them more dangerous. They didn't need to enslave the monarchs directly, not when they could be replicated, recreated, and used like tools. With no more words, Tarnak opened a dark portal and vanished into the void. Yogamont followed, leaving only 3 behind. Raken narrowed his eyes and faced Sillid directly, demanding proof that the Shadow Monarch still retained some trace of humanity. Sillid pulled out a dagger, its blade faintly pulsing with a sickly hue. He said it had pierced him during the battle, and it was coated with poison. Ashbourne, the true Shadow Monarch, would never have needed such a thing. Queresha, the monarch of plagues, tilted her head, her voice low with disdain, as she admitted poison was beneath the Shadow Monarch. If he had truly been in control, he would have crushed Sillid with raw power, not resorted to human cowardice. Sillid's gaze moved between them. The vessel still had limits, weaknesses. That was their opening. He asked again, would they stand with him? This time, Raken's grin stretched wide, his eyes gleaming with bloodlust. Queresha responded with a slow nod, her wicked smile matching the growing tension. The human vessel piqued their interest, and with that, the 3 monarchs boldly decided to challenge and kill the Shadow Monarch. Meanwhile, above the surface, a somber atmosphere enveloped the city as rain poured relentlessly. Atop a towering skyscraper, Jinwoo stood unmoving, the downpour soaking him, yet his expression remained still as stone. His eyes scanned the city below, sharp and unyielding, trying to trace even the faintest ripple of the Frost Monarch's magic. But it was gone. He recalled the moment Sillid declared himself in his original form, a truth that aligned with what the Monarch of Giants had told him. Monarchs and rulers, in their true states, could not be transformed into shadows. That meant his usual means of tracking, his shadows, were useless now. But as the wind howled around him, Jinwoo's eyes remained firm, glinting with resolve. He didn't need shadows to hunt. As long as he was a hunter, he would not miss his prey. Across the city, deep within the Korean Hunters Association, the boardroom was filled with grim faces. A week had passed since President Go Gun-hee's death, and the chair at the head of the table remained hauntingly empty. The time had come to appoint a successor. One of the senior executives finally broke the silence, remarking that the association had always been led by an S rank, a symbol of strength that kept the great guilds in balance. Without someone of that stature, things could spiral. Another member countered with caution, warning that power alone wasn't enough. Leadership wasn't just about rank. After a long debate, a name was finally offered: Wu Jinchul. His head lifted in disbelief, eyes widening slightly as he asked, almost reflexively, if they were serious. But the board remained firm. They reminded him that no one had worked closer with the late chairman than he had. He had inherited not just President Go's experience, but also his values, and his leadership during countless critical moments had earned him respect throughout the association. Still, Jinchul hesitated, claiming there were others more qualified, older, stronger, more suited. He wasn't an S rank, he wasn't ready. Yet the board was quick to clarify that no law dictated the chairman had to be an S rank. What mattered was trust, and Jinchul had it, not just from them, but from the one man whose influence could shift nations, Sung Jinwoo. They didn't pressure him. They merely asked him to consider. And after a long pause, Jinchul finally gave a quiet nod, accepting the weight of the legacy now placed on his shoulders. At the same time, far across the ocean, deep within the Scavenger Guild's headquarters, Thomas Andre walked alongside Laura as they made their way down into the guild's secured lower levels. His voice echoed lightly off the stone walls as he muttered that it had been ages since he last visited this place. The guards at the entrance to the vault snapped to attention, startled by his presence, but Thomas gave a grin and waved them off, telling them to relax. He was here for something important. He placed his thumb on the scanner, and with a low mechanical hum, the doors parted to reveal the vault. Laura followed him inside, glancing around with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain, as she asked if he truly intended to give away what was stored here. Thomas didn't look back as he answered with calm certainty, saying that after what Jinwoo did for him, and for the guild, it was the least he could do. Inside the room, an eerie energy pulsed in the air as they approached a sealed display case. The overhead lights flickered slightly as the two of them stepped closer, and Laura noted softly that there were only 2 such daggers in the entire world. Their rarity wasn't just legendary, it was historic. But Thomas, without a hint of hesitation, remarked that such weapons weren't meant to sleep in glass coffins, they were forged to be used. As the light caught the glass, the blades inside shimmered. Twin daggers, gray-hilted with crimson edges that pulsed like living blood, rested within, humming with restrained power, as though awaiting a hand strong enough to unleash them. In Korea, a crowd had gathered outside the Ajin Guild's office. Whispers rippled through the people as disbelief spread like wildfire. Thomas Andre, the world's strongest hunter, was inside the modest guild's building. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream. Inside, Jinho sat stiffly, struggling to maintain composure before the towering figure of the Goliath himself. His forced smile barely masked the tension, and sweat clung to his forehead. The other staff weren't faring any better, unable to process the fact that Thomas Andre had walked into their office like it was routine. The air was heavy, not just from Thomas's presence, but also because Leonard Nierman, the top hunter from Germany, was there as well. 2 hours had passed since their arrival, yet Jinwoo remained absent. Jinho, doing his best to seem composed, offered a weak smile as he dialed once more, silently pleading for his boss to answer. Leonard sat in silence, his expression unreadable, though a faint edge of frustration peeked through. He wondered whether he'd even get the chance to meet Jinwoo today, especially with Thomas already waiting. Nearby, Laura translated with calm precision as her boss speculated whether Jinwoo was caught in a raid somewhere, noting how it didn't seem like the man came to the office much. Jinho nodded uneasily, confirming her suspicions while racking his brain over where Jinwoo might be. Then the office doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and Jinwoo stepped in. His presence instantly washed relief across the staff. Jinho leapt up, nearly stumbling as he hurried to his boss. He questioned why Jinwoo hadn't answered his calls, his voice tinged with desperation. Jinwoo, still composed despite his disheveled appearance, replied simply that the recent wave of gate outbreaks had kept him busy. While they spoke, Thomas rose from his seat and approached with the easy confidence of a man who'd never been second to anyone. He greeted Jinwoo casually, and the room fell into a nervous silence. Jinho, standing close, felt the shift in the air and couldn't help but worry whether the two would clash right there in the office. Jinwoo, curious, asked what brought Thomas to Korea. Thomas smiled and reminded him of their agreement to share a meal once his arm had healed. But that wasn't all. He added that he'd brought something for Jinwoo, a rare gift. Jinwoo's brow arched, surprised by the mention of a gift. Thomas suggested they move somewhere private. What he had in hand wasn't something to be handed over in a public office. Jinho overheard and grew suspicious his gut twisting with concern. What if it was a trap? Jinwoo, however, shifted his attention toward the other hunter in the room. Leonard stepped forward and introduced himself respectfully. Jinwoo immediately assumed Leonard was there to request some kind of protection commission. But before he could inquire further, Thomas stepped between them and insisted Jinwoo come with him, subtly making it clear this matter held priority. Leonard's patience finally snapped. He argued that after waiting over 2 hours, he deserved to be part of the conversation. But one glare from Thomas silenced him. The message was clear. The upcoming discussion was confidential, and Leonard had no place in it. Inside, Leonard simmered with frustration. He wasn't used to being pushed aside, especially not like this. But there was nothing he could do. The difference in strength was undeniable as he watched Jinwoo walk away with the American hunter. Not long after, the two sat across from each other at a quiet dinner table, joined by their respective associates. Thomas wasted no time. A snap of his fingers summoned his bodyguards, who stepped forward with a briefcase. He made it clear this was a token of gratitude for sparing the lives of his guild members during their last encounter. The briefcase opened with a soft clack, revealing 2 deadly daggers embedded into a giant scale. Jinwoo's eyes locked onto them, instantly recognizing the material. The look on his face said it all. The weapon had been crafted from Kamish's remains. Thomas, impressed by the swift recognition, confirmed it. Jinwoo, still processing, questioned it aloud. Wasn't Kamish's corpse under strict guard by the Hunters Bureau? Thomas explained that while the US government held most of Kamish's remains, he had kept something for himself. During their battle, he had pulled out the dragon's largest canine tooth and kept it as a souvenir. With that same easy grin, he added that he'd eventually had the tooth crafted into a pair of daggers. They were too short to make swords, but perfect as dual weapons. At the time, he hadn't known how useful they'd become, but now he believed they had found their purpose. Jinwoo reached down and pulled one of the daggers from the case. The weight of it, the raw pressure radiating from the blade, it was overwhelming. A prompt flickered into view, revealing the weapon's name, Kamish's Wrath, boasting a staggering attack power of over 1,500. He stood still, momentarily stunned. Nothing he had wielded before came close. The Demon King's daggers seemed like toys in comparison. With a few light swings, Jinwoo realized these weren't ordinary daggers. It felt like wielding a broadsword in each hand. Across from him, Thomas raised a brow and half joked, cautioning Jinwoo that even with his insane durability, those blades could probably pierce him without much effort. He nervously asked if Jinwoo planned to test them on him. Jinwoo calmed his grip and lowered the weapon. The dark crimson aura around the blade faded, as if the weapon recognized its new master. The room grew still, the energy lingering like a storm about to break. Thomas turned back to Jinwoo and asked with a faint smile how he liked the gift. Jinwoo remained quiet for a moment before questioning whether he could really accept such a powerful item without offering anything in return. Thomas didn't hesitate. To him, the daggers were a small price to repay what Jinwoo had done. Jinwoo finally nodded and expressed his gratitude, carefully placing the blade back. The satisfaction in his eyes brought a rare joy to Thomas, who leaned back with a sense of contentment, but it didn't last long. Suddenly, both hunters froze. Their senses flared in alarm, a surge of danger impossible to ignore. Thomas turned to Jinwoo, his voice low and tense as he asked if he had felt it too. Jinwoo gave a brief nod before both bolted to the nearest window. Outside, the city of Seoul had ground to a halt. Cars stopped in the streets. People stood frozen, staring upward with pale, lifeless expressions. The sky had changed. It wasn't just the pressure, it was something deeper. Jinwoo's mind raced as he saw it, the massive magical presence they had felt. This was its true form. Beside him, Thomas muttered under his breath. It was the largest gate he had ever seen, even dwarfing the one Kamish had emerged from. His disbelief echoed the thoughts rushing through his head. Logic had just been torn apart. Reality itself felt like it was unraveling. Something unimaginable was coming. On the ground, stunned onlookers began snapping pictures with their phones, trying to capture the surreal moment. Reporters had gathered too, broadcasting updates with urgency in their voices. They emphasized the unprecedented magnitude of the gate. It was the largest ever recorded since the appearance of magical beasts. Elsewhere in the world, Dr. Belzer, who had long warned about the growing mass of magical energy gathering above the skies, addressed the rising global concern. To him, the gate in Korea wasn't an isolated incident. It was a harbinger. He predicted that such colossal gates could soon begin appearing across other nations as well. When a reporter asked what the wisest course of action might be in response to the event, Dr. Belzer, despite all his expertise in magical beasts and gate phenomena, gave a bleak response. All he could offer was a grim plea to pray, hoping the situation wouldn't spiral into disaster. Meanwhile, Jinwoo soared through the skies on Kaisel, heading straight for the massive gate looming over the city. As Kaisel glided beneath it, Jinwoo scanned the sky above, taking in the sheer size and presence of the anomaly. But as he drew closer, something unexpected happened. He couldn't pass through. An invisible wall blocked his advance, halting him mid-air. No matter how much he pushed, the barrier didn't budge. Jinwoo narrowed his eyes, analyzing the invisible force. This wasn't ordinary. It wasn't a barrier that even the most powerful awakened hunters could break. His thoughts churned with growing unease. If this gate truly held creatures more dangerous than anything they had faced before, then his friends, his family, everyone he cared about, were in danger. A vibration in his pocket snapped him back to the moment. His phone buzzed with the call he had been waiting for. Woo Jin-chul, the new chairman of the Korean Hunters Association, was on the line, calling to share the findings from the Hunter Bureau. The Bureau had finished its scans using satellite tech. Every inch of the planet had been surveyed, but there were no signs of other gates. This massive anomaly above Seoul was the only one. Jinwoo's mind spiraled through the implications. For 3 hours since the gate's sudden appearance, the world had remained eerily quiet. Not a single new gate had opened elsewhere. That couldn't be coincidence. Something larger was unfolding, something orchestrated. Jin-chul then informed him that authorities were now moving to evacuate civilians living near the gate, bracing for the worst. He asked Jinwoo directly what his next move would be. Jinwoo didn't hesitate. With firm resolve, he made it clear that no matter what came through that gate, he would stand his ground and face it. Ending the call, he slipped the phone away and turned his gaze upward once more. The gate loomed silently, motionless and menacing. Later that day, Jinwoo stepped into the Hunter Association's gymnasium, the space already prepared for what was to be an intense sparring session. Without hesitation, Baru surged forward, moving at lightning speed, his limbs a blur as he struck. Yet Jinwoo, calm and focused, dodged every attack with ease. Baru lunged again, his mandibles wide in a fierce attempt to land a blow, but Jinwoo intercepted the strike mid-air, catching the mandibles in one hand. For a moment, Baru froze, his compound eyes blinking in stunned silence. He hadn't expected his king's power to outmatch his own this overwhelmingly. Jinwoo looked at him calmly, wondering aloud if Baru was truly giving his all. The words stung, and Baru immediately dropped to one knee, asking forgiveness. But Jinwoo reassured him it was just a warm-up and admitted that Baru was the only one capable of giving him a real challenge anymore. The affirmation filled Baru with a deep, reverent emotion, and he bowed his head even lower, declaring his loyalty with all sincerity. Jinwoo, slightly embarrassed by the theatrics, chuckled and teased him about how expressive he had become lately. Then, shaking off the moment, Jinwoo took his stance again and focused, signaling with a nod that it was time to continue. Baru, already maxed out at commander rank, let out a sharp screech and launched into the air, wings buzzing with energy. He came down like a missile, slashing with deadly precision, but Jinwoo dodged without flinching. Each of Baru's strikes whistled through empty space as Jinwoo remained a phantom, just out of reach. When Baru launched a left hook, Jinwoo raised an elbow and blocked it effortlessly. Acknowledging the improvement, Jinwoo noted how much stronger Baru had become since evolving to commander rank. Their sparring grew fiercer. Baru's pace quickened, his strikes harder, more desperate. But no matter how relentless the assault, Jinwoo danced through it all, using the session to test both Baru's evolution and his own current limits. Then came Jinwoo's counterattack. A powerful left hook struck Baru square in the chest, sending the ant staggering backwards. Jinwoo reminded him, coolly but firmly, that there could only be one commander in the army. With Igris and Greed steadily closing in on the general rank, it wouldn't be long before they challenged him for that title. Baru's eyes flared at the thought, his pride suddenly on fire. He let out a guttural roar, the sound echoing across the gym as he threw himself back into the match with renewed fury, determined to prove he was still worthy. Jinwoo, watching every move, came to a quiet realization. Even though Baru remained the strongest in his army, he still wasn't strong enough to face the threats that might soon emerge. The sparring session neared its end as Jinwoo delivered a final blow, sending Baru flying across the gym. The summon crashed into the far wall with a thud that shook the room. Slumped against the cracked surface, Baru raised his head slowly, awestruck, and once again acknowledged the vast power of his king. Jinwoo chuckled at the melodrama, shaking his head as he teased Baru about needing to start blocking historical drama channels. Baru, flustered and saddened by the thought, looked up at him with pleading eyes, silently begging him not to take them away. With the sparring over, Jinwoo glanced around the gymnasium and let out a quiet sigh. The place was wrecked. Pulling out his phone, he called the chairman, casually explaining the situation and offering to have his ant shadow soldiers handle the repairs. On the other side of the city, in a high-rise hotel in Seoul, Thomas Andre stood by the window as he gazed at the colossal gate looming over the skyline. Its eerie presence dominated the heavens, casting a shadow that reached even here. Beside him, Laura, his ever-loyal assistant, stood quietly. She couldn't help but wonder why, with evacuation protocols already in motion and international flights grounded, Thomas had chosen to remain. Thomas simply said he was drawn to the power emanating from that gate. There was no fear in him, only a deep, primal intrigue. Something about the unknown beyond that rift called to him. It wasn't something he could control, nor something he could claim, and that made it all the more irresistible. For Thomas, there was no reason to turn back now. Laura, however, reminded him that the Hunters Bureau was growing increasingly anxious. They feared what might come through, what horrors this gate could release upon the world. But Thomas merely let out a soft chuckle, swirling the wine in his glass as he confidently claimed there was no safer place in the universe than by Jinwoo's side. Yet beneath the bravado, Thomas knew the truth. If they couldn't stop whatever was about to emerge from that gate, then there would be nothing left beyond it. Somewhere deep inside, he wondered whether this would mark the end of humanity or the beginning of something entirely new. In the heart of Seoul, the streets pulsed with tension as honking cars and hurried footsteps echoed off the buildings. Evacuation orders were in full swing, and the Hunter Association directed the chaos, herding civilians to safety. Above it all, perched atop a high-rise, Jinwoo sat alone in silence, his eyes fixed on the dark gate growing ever more unstable in the sky. Too many lives were at stake, and though he had faced countless threats before, this time, it felt heavier than ever. Snapping out of his thoughts, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, quietly wondering who he'd want to spend his final moments with, if this battle truly became his last. Elsewhere, inside a quiet dojo, the rhythmic clash of wooden blades rang through the air. Cha Hyen moved with practiced grace, fully immersed in her training, but the moment her phone buzzed against the wall, her movements faltered. She reached for it, glanced at the screen, and answered. Whatever was said in those few moments made her brow shift ever so slightly. She turned toward her master, requesting to leave. Something urgent had come up. With a silent bow and the master's nod, she walked away, a quiet resolve beginning to form in her chest. Not long after, in a seemingly out-of-place corner of the city, the amusement park was buzzing with life. Amid this fragile peace, a ripple spread through the crowd. Sharp eyes had spotted Jinwoo and Hyen walking side by side, their casual pace drawing whispers. Some gasped softly, murmuring excitedly about a possible date between the famed S-rank hunters. Jinwoo scanned the area, surprised to see how many people still filled the park, despite the danger hanging overhead. Beside him, Hyen kept her gaze low, her cheeks tinged red as she spoke quietly, wondering aloud if he liked places like this. Jinwoo answered in his usual calm tone that he didn't particularly enjoy them, but there had always been a part of him that wanted to experience it at least once. Hyen looked at him, slightly puzzled, asking why he would come somewhere just out of curiosity. With a faint smile, Jinwoo told her that she was his only friend. Her steps faltered for a moment, the warmth in his words catching her off guard. Then he brought up their past, mentioning the battle against the architect. Hyen flushed immediately, remembering what she had said then, not realizing he'd been conscious enough to hear. Jinwoo teased her gently, saying he had pretty good hearing. Hyen muttered something under her breath and looked away, still embarrassed. But her curiosity hadn't faded. She asked about the mystery of that dungeon, her tone laced with hesitation. Jinwoo's gaze lingered on the crowd for a moment before telling her it wasn't something he could explain just yet. He needed more time to process it himself. Hyen nodded, quietly accepting his answer. Her attention drifted again, this time to the shadows positioned strategically throughout the park. Jinwoo's elite soldiers stood like statues, forming an invisible wall around them. She asked softly if it might attract too much attention. He replied with an ease that it was fine. As she relaxed into the moment, Hyen realized how long it had been since she felt this light. No responsibilities, no monsters, just walking. With Jinwoo beside her, the pressure she always carried seemed to slip away. There was something different about his presence. It wasn't just comforting, it grounded her. Jinwoo's eyes, however, wandered across the attractions. He asked if Hyen wanted to try a ride, and she responded a bit too eagerly. Every time he offered a suggestion, she nodded with a smile. Jinwoo soon realized she might have always wanted to come to a place like this too. That decided it. If Hyen wanted to try everything, then they'd try everything. Their first stop was the roller coaster, but neither of them flinched. Then came the drop tower. Again, no real reaction. The haunted house was next. Ghosts jumped from every corner, but after a few failed attempts to startle them, Even the ghosts looked confused, doubting their own effectiveness. Eventually, they settled down on a bench, snacks in hand. Heian took a sip from her drink, while Jinwoo asked if she was enjoying herself. She nodded and said she was, but something in her voice wasn't convincing enough. Jinwoo leaned back slightly, noting aloud that the rides weren't exactly thrilling. Heian hesitated before admitting that he was right. He smirked and asked if she wanted to try something more fun. She blinked, not quite sure what he meant, until the world dropped away beneath them and the sky opened up. Kaisel soared high above the clouds, wings slicing through the wind with effortless grace. Heian's hair whipped around her face as she held on, overwhelmed by the sheer exhilaration. The height, the speed. It was everything the rides hadn't been. The wind softened, turning warm and golden as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The sky stretched endlessly, painted in orange and amber. Heian turned to Jinwoo, asking quietly why he would go to an amusement park when he could simply do this. His voice was gentler now, as he said the park had been built over the gate where his father disappeared. He had always wanted to visit the place, just once. Heian didn't respond with words. Instead, she leaned closer and wrapped her arms around Jinwoo, a soft embrace filled with gratitude. He didn't move, letting the silence speak for them. After a while, Jinwoo mentioned there was still something he wanted to show her. Kaisel flew farther, across vast landscapes until they arrived in a secluded forest, untouched and endless. As they landed, Heian took in the sight, an endless stretch of trees, still and pure. Sitting beside Jinwoo, she smiled quietly and rested her head on his shoulder. The two of them lay quietly intertwined, bathed in the soft glow of starlight as the serene stillness of the night enveloped them. When morning came, sunlight spilled across the forest, glinting off a waterfall nearby. Heian knelt down to drink from the cool stream while Jinwoo stepped out from between the trees, wearing his overcoat. He told her there was a hotel not far from here, and that they should head there, grab a meal, and clean up. She agreed immediately. A moment later, Kaisel soared into the sky once again, carrying them both toward the horizon. Outside the Korean Hunter Association, the atmosphere buzzed with unease. A middle-aged hunter stepped out of the headquarters. He had just been promoted to B rank, a milestone that filled him with quiet pride. As he strolled down the street, lost in thoughts of celebration, a figure brushed past him, hard enough to jolt him out of his reverie. He spun around, irritation flashing across his face, ready to bark at whoever had bumped him, but the words caught in his throat. Looming before him was a massive figure cloaked in a wild, monstrous aura. The man's breath caught in his throat as his eyes met those of the beast monarch, though he didn't yet realize who or what he was facing. A stunned crowd began to form, whispers crackling through the tension like sparks. But the hunter, still emboldened by his recent achievement, refused to back down. His voice rose with forced confidence, demanding that the beast watch where he was going, demanding an apology for the shove. Raken didn't respond with words. His jaw stretched open wide, revealing rows of jagged shark-like teeth, and his glowing red eyes locked onto the hunter. A bit later, the air was filled with the sickening crunch of bone and the squelch of tearing flesh. In a flash, the B-rank hunter was gone, devoured whole, his blood splattering across the pavement. Fear gripped the souls of the surrounding hunters as chaos erupted all around them. Raken's grin deepened, lips stained crimson as he basked in the terror. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, hurling cars into the air like pebbles, each impact scattering metal and fire across the street. One hunter barely had time to turn before a flying vehicle crushed him. A roar tore from Raken's throat, loud, guttural, and laced with primal fury. The monstrous sound rolled across the city like thunder. His voice, though spoken in the tongue of beasts, carried a message as clear as death. He declared the hunt had begun and vowed to tear through flesh and bone, devouring all who dared stand in his way. The beast monarch challenged anyone, if they had the courage, to step forward and try to stop him. Back at the association, Chairman Wu Jinchul shot to his feet as the news hit. His voice cracked with disbelief as he demanded a situation report. The associate, pale and sweating, stammered that the number of casualties was still unknown. Whatever this thing was, it hadn't stopped since it appeared. Time was running out. Frustration surged through Jinchul as he grappled with the escalating crisis. His thoughts were already consumed by the impending dungeon disaster, and now, this beast had appeared out of nowhere. His voice hardened as he urgently asked about Jinwoo's whereabouts, but the associate reported that no one had been able to reach him. Gritting his teeth, Jinchul moved toward the door, fully prepared to face the beast himself if he had to, but before he could leave, an employee rushed in, panting and breathless. Someone had appeared, a hunter capable of matching the beast's strength. Jinchul's heart skipped a beat as he asked if Jinwoo had arrived, but the employee shook his head and clarified. It wasn't Jinwoo, but a world-class hunter who just happened to be nearby. Outside, Leonard Nierman stood face to face with the nightmare that had descended on Seoul. Germany's strongest hunter could feel the ground trembling with each step Raken took. The stench of blood coated the air, and a creeping doubt tried to worm its way into his thoughts. Leonard steeled himself, tightening his jaw, readying for the battle ahead. But just as he prepared to move toward the monster, Thomas Andre approached from behind, his towering form exuding power as his eyes locked onto the beast monarch. He told Leonard plainly to step back. This wasn't his fight, and if he didn't move, he'd just get in the way. Meanwhile, far from the chaos of Seoul, the morning sun warmed a peaceful countryside. Inside a quiet restaurant, the soft clatter of plates and the scent of fresh breakfast filled the air. Jinwoo sat calmly at a corner table until his phone began to vibrate relentlessly. He answered with a brief greeting, only to hear Chairman Jinchul's voice on the other end, strained and panicked as he explained that a monster had appeared out of nowhere and was tearing through the city with terrifying force. Jinwoo's expression darkened as he asked how that could be possible, reminding him that the dungeon break wasn't due for days, but Jinchul confirmed the truth. This creature hadn't come from the gate. It was a lone monster, and it had already wiped out an entire guild. This wasn't something they were prepared for. Jinwoo's mind raced. He had stationed shadow soldiers across Seoul to report anything suspicious, and yet there had been no warning. He reached out through the link, but felt only silence. The connection was faint, the voices of his shadows distant and muted, like whispers through a wall. Even the summoning coordinates for shadow exchange had vanished. Something was blocking them, something powerful and deliberate. Jinwoo's thoughts darkened as he asked the one question that could confirm his fear. Did the monster have a shadow? There was a short pause on the line before Jinchul confirmed that it didn't. The creature had cloaked itself completely, even from Jinwoo's reach. Back in Seoul, Leonard watched as Thomas Andre strode confidently toward the beast. Nearby hunters stood in awe as the Goliath stepped onto the battlefield, squaring up against Raken. Sensing the urgency, Thomas ordered them to start evacuating civilians, then turned his full focus to the enemy before him. The monarch's twisted grin widened as he recognized the threat in front of him, and without hesitation, he lunged. His massive claws slashed forward with terrifying speed, raking across Thomas's chest, but the blow barely slowed him down. Thomas's muscles coiled as he retaliated with a bone-crushing punch that sent Raken's head whipping to the side. Dust exploded from the cracked ground as Thomas pressed in, another devastating blow following without pause, yet Raken's expression didn't waver. If anything, the beast seemed thrilled. Without wasting another second, Thomas grabbed the monarch by the head and slammed him into the street, the impact shaking nearby buildings and sending rubble flying. As the clash between the two titans raged, Choi Jong-in arrived at the scene, stepping out of his vehicle with urgency etched across his face. His eyes scanned the chaos before him as he asked for a status update on the evacuation. A subordinate quickly approached and reported that the process was still ongoing. Hunters from various guilds, including the Fiend Guild and the White Tiger Guild, were doing everything they could to clear civilians from the area, but Jong-in's attention had already shifted. He could feel it, an oppressive pressure in the air that twisted his gut. The sheer presence of the magic beast ahead was unlike anything he had felt before. Not even the Jeju Island raid had carried this kind of overwhelming dread. Something about it was wrong. Watching from afar, he narrowed his eyes at the distant battle tearing through the city and wondered what kind of monster Thomas Andre had engaged. In the heart of the destruction, Thomas didn't let up. His full-powered fist crashed against the beast monarch's jaw, sending the creature hurtling backward, carving a deep scar through the asphalt before slamming into a building. The concrete structure cracked under the force, yet even that wasn't enough to bring the monster down. Without even a second to breathe, Raken emerged from the dust with terrifying speed. His monstrous form blitzed forward, and in an instant, his skull rammed into Thomas's torso with brutal momentum. But the Goliath didn't budge. Bracing himself, Thomas dug his foot into the ground, absorbing the impact like a stone wall, then wrapped his arms around Raken's waist. With a roar of exertion, he hurled the beast into the air and slammed him down in a crushing suplex. The impact of the attack shattered the earth around them. Yet even that wasn't enough to end it. Raken retaliated in a blur, delivering a powerful kick that slammed into Thomas's jaw with monstrous force. The blow launched Thomas into the air like a missile as debris trailed violently in his wake. Landing lightly, Raken stood tall and grinning, blood matting the fur on his jaw as he basked in the fleeting edge he'd gained. But Thomas wasn't fazed. He landed on his feet a moment later, staring down the beast monarch, and with a determined look, activated his reinforcement skill. The White Tiger Guild arrived at the subjugation site, led by Baek Yoonho. As they prepared to join the containment efforts, something massive crashed into the ground nearby, sending a shockwave rippling through the street. Baek staggered slightly, his gaze locking on the cloud of dust, and from it, the monstrous form of Raken emerged, radiating a menacing energy so thick it felt like a storm pressing down on his chest. Baek's breath caught. That kind of mana. It was suffocating, far beyond anything he had ever encountered. His eyes darted across the battlefield until they landed on another colossal figure, Thomas Andre, cloaked in his full armor, standing tall and unyielding. The scale of the clash unfolding before him left Baek speechless. He had seen powerful beings before, but this was something else entirely. Thomas caught sight of Baek's team and barked out a warning, motioning for them to take cover. The battle ahead wasn't something they could interfere with. Raken's bloodlust thickened the air, his jaws stretched open, hunger burning in his crimson eyes as he prepared to charge again. Baek instinctively began to shift into his beast form, sensing the gravity of the threat. But before he could fully transform, Raken was suddenly in front of him. Baek froze. His body refused to move, instincts screaming at him to stay still, to hide, to survive. The beast in him knew better than to challenge the apex predator standing inches away. His knees trembled, his transformation reversed on its own as he reverted to human form, unable to meet Raken's eyes. But Raken didn't care. He merely passed by, uninterested, fixated on his true prey. Then the ground itself seemed to rebel as Raken extended his claws, lifting debris and vehicles into the air as if gravity had abandoned the area. With a casual flick, he sent the wreckage hurtling toward Thomas like missiles. But Thomas didn't flinch. He batted each projectile aside effortlessly, advancing step by step toward the beast monarch. Then Thomas raised his hand, and the battlefield warped around him. His gravitational field expanded outward, pulling everything into his center, including Raken. The beast monarch tried to resist, but the pull was relentless. In one swift motion, Thomas yanked the beast toward him, raised both fists, and slammed them down onto Raken's back with the force of a collapsing mountain. The impact tore a crater into the street, but Thomas wasn't finished. He lunged forward, fists hammering down with machine-like precision, each blow cracking bone and shaking the earth. Blood sprayed, the concrete shattered, and still, Thomas struck. But something felt wrong. Even as he overwhelmed his opponent, a cold unease crept up his spine. It didn't make sense. He was winning, yet the feeling of victory was absent. There was no fear in the monster's eyes, no desperation, only anticipation. He raised his fist one last time, preparing to end it, when suddenly, Raken caught it, effortlessly. Thomas's eyes widened. The beast monarch stood, his form now shifting, bones snapping and reshaping as a coat of white fur enveloped him. Raken chuckled darkly, amused that a mere puppet of a fragment had pushed him this far. But he was done playing. In the blink of an eye, his claws slashed forward, faster than Thomas could track. The sound of tearing armor echoed as Thomas struggled to stay upright, parrying with everything he had. But the assault didn't stop. Raken grabbed him by the throat, his grin widening as he mocked Thomas with a twisted invitation, a contest of strength. He crushed Thomas's armor in his grip, but the moment it cracked apart, Raken blinked in surprise. Thomas was gone. Before he could react, arms coiled around his neck from behind, Thomas had slipped past him, locking in a chokehold with brute force. Thomas clenched his teeth, tightening the hold with everything he had, trying to bring the monster down. But Raken didn't panic. He let out a bone-chilling growl as his head twisted unnaturally, rotating 180 degrees with a sickening snap. Thomas barely had time to react before the beast broke free, spun around, and seized him by the face. Raken lifted him like a doll, then slammed him into the ground with a thunderous crash. The pavement split apart beneath them. The beast monarch then climbed onto the fallen Thomas, his iron grip still clutching his face as he leaned in, voice dripping with hunger. He was ready to devour Thomas whole. But before he could strike, a beam of magic tore through the air, crashing into Raken's face and sending him tumbling back. He skidded across the battlefield as the momentum dragged him away from his prey. Raken rose with a snarl, eyes burning, and turned to face the source of the attack. Leonard Neerman stood firm beside the fallen Thomas, mana swirling around him, his stance unwavering despite the overwhelming threat before him. Leonard's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow as the beast monarch turned toward him, eyes burning with murderous rage. A chill ran down his spine. Thomas, still conscious beneath him, recognized the danger and, with a weak breath, told him to run, urging him to leave before death claimed them both. But Leonard shook his head, trembling, refusing to abandon him. He stood his ground, knees shaking, teeth clenched. He told himself he had no regrets. He had made his choice. But as the monstrous figure drew closer with each thunderous step, That resolve began to crack. The sheer weight of Raken's presence bore down on him like a mountain. The German hunter's limbs locked in place. He had made the wrong choice. That much became clear as Raken lunged forward, jaws wide open, aiming to end him in a single brutal instant. But then a violent gust tore past Leonard, followed by the crash of something colliding hard against flesh and bone. His eyes shot open. Raken, just moments from devouring him, was now clamped between the massive jaws of Kaisel. The shadow dragon had descended from the sky and dragged the beast monarch away with explosive force, yanking him off course mid-lunge. Raken, suspended midair, twisted violently within Kaisel's grip. A series of wild slashes tore through the dragon's muzzle, and in a flash of dark mist, Kaisel's form vanished into nothingness. Raken dropped back to the earth, unharmed and still grinning, fangs bared in savage delight. But then, the shadows swirled. From above, something descended with blinding speed. In a sudden blur, Jinwoo appeared out of thin air. With flawless control, he twisted mid-fall and struck Raken clean across the skull with a devastating leg kick. The impact thundered across the battlefield, sending the beast monarch crashing into the ground below, shattering concrete and rupturing the earth from the force of the blow. Jinwoo landed beside Leonard, calm and precise, and without wasting a second, instructed him to get Thomas to safety. Leonard snapped out of his daze, nodded sharply, and immediately helped the injured Goliath to his feet, dragging him away as fast as he could. Raken was already rising from the rubble, his massive form unshaken, eyes now locked onto Jinwoo with cold fury. The beast monarch stared at him, something flickering behind his glare, a recognition. He could sense it now, unmistakably. The shadow monarch's power coursed through the man in front of him. Rage twisted Raken's expression. Jinwoo could feel the intense killing intent radiating from Raken, but something else tugged at his senses. There was more than one threat here. From the other side of the battlefield, a familiar frostbitten chill began creeping in. Ice crackled across the ground as the frost monarch emerged beside Raken. His voice was venomous, his words laced with contempt as he spoke of Shadow Monarch's arrangement with the administrator, suggesting that Jinwoo's power wasn't born of chance, but carefully orchestrated. The air thickened. Then, from below, a sickening chorus of buzzing filled the silence. Thousands of insects poured from sewer grates, swarming together in a chaotic cloud. They twisted, merged, and formed into a slender, yet menacing figure. The queen of insects had arrived. Kurasha's piercing gaze locked onto Jinwoo, her tone curious and hungry as she mused aloud how it might feel to devour a fellow monarch. Jinwoo's expression turned cold. The battlefield had shifted. He wasn't facing a lone threat anymore, but three monarchs, each radiating ancient, world-ending power. System notifications flickered into his vision like alarm bells, identifying the Frost Monarch, the Beast Monarch, and the Plague Monarch as his sworn enemies. Both ends of the battlefield were blocked. There was no escape, but Jinwoo didn't waver. With a chilling calm, he gave a single command, and the earth beneath him cracked open. From the growing darkness at his feet, the Shadow Army rose in full force. Soldiers poured forth in thousands, covering the land like an unholy tide. At the front, Igris and Iron surged ahead, charging directly at the Frost Monarch with synchronized fury. On the opposite flank, Tank let out a feral roar as he and Jimma lunged toward Raken, eager to tear into the Beast Monarch. Meanwhile, Beru and Greed moved with lethal grace, racing toward the Plague Monarch without hesitation. Raken growled with amusement as he observed the new Shadow Monarch's army. Scyllid, however, remained unfazed. He took a slow, deep breath and released a bone-chilling wind that swept across the battlefield. Sensing the incoming threat, Jinwoo raised his daggers, blocking the icy storm rushing toward him. But his summons weren't so lucky. They failed to react in time. The Shadow Army, ready for battle just moments ago, was now trapped in a prison of ice that engulfed the area. Scyllid's voice echoed across the frozen street as he belittled Jinwoo's efforts, dismissing his soldiers as nothing more than small fries. He found it laughable that Jinwoo thought mere summons could stand in the way of the monarchs. To him, the idea that a human had truly absorbed the full power of the Shadow Monarch was nothing but a joke. From a distance, Kurasha made a light-hearted, mocking remark. She lamented the fate of her insect children, now frozen solid, as if seeing them again after so long stirred some twisted nostalgia. Jinwoo stood still, hand clenched around Kamish's wrath, as the monarch's mocking voices echoed around him. They made it clear that while the Shadow Monarch had once been the strongest among them, they would not allow their power to be underestimated again. Yet despite the frozen battlefield and the overwhelming might of his enemies, Jinwoo's rage burned even hotter. With a defiant growl, he shattered the ice around his dagger, locked eyes with the Frost Monarch, and pointed his blade toward him. His voice was cold and resolute, as he vowed to kill Scyllid, no matter what it took. The Frost Monarch grimaced, furious at Jinwoo's audacity. With a flick of his hand, he summoned monstrous golems from the frozen earth. Towering figures of ice and stone rose, prepared to crush everything in their path. Meanwhile, the Plague Monarch joined the fray, reanimating corpses from the battlefield into grotesque, spider-like abominations. But Jinwoo struck first. As the creatures swarmed toward him, he moved like a blur, twin daggers cutting through the air with precision. One by one, he shredded the human spiders that leapt at him. Then, a massive ice golem charged and brought down its colossal foot. The impact swept everything in its radius, but Jinwoo judged the timing perfectly. He flashed past the attack and sliced the golem's head in two. Two more golems lunged, claws ready to tear him apart, but Jinwoo was faster. With ruthless speed, he pierced them both, shattering them into icy debris. Without pause, he launched himself like a missile toward the Frost Monarch. Scyllid barely had time to react. In a blink, Jinwoo appeared in front of him, daggers raised for the kill. But just as Kamish's wrath was about to strike, Raken intervened, slashing from behind with his claws. But Jinwoo slipped past the attack, and moments later, a sharp echo rang across the battlefield as his daggers clashed with Raken's steely claws. Raken smirked, mocking Jinwoo. He was convinced no blade could harm him, but Kamish's wrath was no ordinary weapon. It sliced clean through Raken's wrist, severing it completely. Blood sprayed across the ground as the Beast Monarch howled in disbelief. Jinwoo had no time to revel in the blow. A new threat emerged. Koresha appeared mid-air, hurling a hand imbued with mana at him. Jinwoo barely dodged the magical strike. At the same time, Raken calmly began reattaching his severed wrist. Jinwoo exhaled sharply, realizing the battle was far from over. All three monarchs, the Frost Monarch with his golems, the Plague Monarch with her twisted creations, and the Beast Monarch, fully regenerated, advanced in perfect synchronization. Just as the situation turned grim, a sharp crack of ice echoed behind him. Jinwoo turned to see a familiar figure letting out a piercing screech. Beru, his powerful ant commander, had broken free from the ice prison. His instinct to protect his king overwhelmed every other impulse. With a cry that echoed through the street, Beru burst forth. The Frost Monarch stood in disbelief, stunned that one of Jinwoo's shadow soldiers had shattered his binding spell. He was awestruck, realizing that a commander-level entity like Beru was under the control of a human. Even the Beast Monarch faltered for a moment. He recognized the might of a shadow commander, and Beru, in his eyes, was nothing short of a god of destruction. But the Queen of Insects was unfazed. With disdain, she called Beru a disobedient child, intent on punishing him. She extended her hand to crush him mid-air, but Beru didn't flinch. Enraged, he darted forward and shredded her mana-infused hand with ease. The Plague Monarch reeled back in shock. With Koresha momentarily subdued, Beru returned to Jinwoo's side. He landed beside him, kneeling with reverence, his words filled with admiration for his king's strength. But there was no time for pride. The dead moved once again, more twisted corpses racing toward them. Jinwoo and Beru shifted into attack mode. They tore through the oncoming threats, but in the chaos, Koresha struck. Her attack pierced through Beru. Jinwoo turned to help, but another massive shadow loomed overhead, a colossal palm crashing down on him. The blow hurled him into a building, dust and rubble clouding the air. Dazed by the impact, Jinwoo struggled to rise, but before he could regain full awareness, his gaze lifted to see a hail of ice arrows cascading toward him. Thousands of them, sharp and deadly, rained down like spears from the sky. Yet Jinwoo didn't flinch. He stood his ground, deflecting each one with flawless precision. The Frost Monarch, watching from atop an icy spire, couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration. Still, with a smug grin, he taunted Jinwoo, questioning how long he could endure an onslaught coming from every direction. Before Scyllid could finish his taunt, a dagger shot through his chest. He gasped, eyes widening in disbelief as he looked down at the blade. When his gaze shifted upward, he found Jinwoo standing before him, cold and unwavering. In a voice as sharp as the dagger lodged in his body, Jinwoo reminded Scyllid that he wouldn't leave this battlefield alive, and he fully intended to keep that promise. Scyllid's blood surged with fury. That a mere human had landed such a blow on a monarch. It was an insult. Jinwoo, watching the creature's face twist in anger, realized something crucial. Piercing the heart wasn't enough. Not for a monarch. He needed to do much more. Without a moment's hesitation, Jinwoo flipped Kamish's wrath into a reverse grip and lunged forward. His movements blurred as he unleashed a brutal flurry of slashes, tearing through ice and air alike in an attempt to overwhelm the Frost Monarch's defenses, but Scyllid, instead of faltering under the storm of attacks, let out a slow, confident smile, because he wasn't alone. Behind Jinwoo, the beast monarch had already moved. Silent as a shadow, he summoned his weapon with a low growl, and in one fluid motion, brought it down across Jinwoo's back. The blade tore through him with savage force, and Jinwoo's body buckled as blood sprayed from his mouth. From a distance, Beru let out a piercing scream as he watched his king struck so viciously. But his cry of anguish was silenced as the queen of insects loomed over him. With twisted pride, she introduced herself as the mother of all insects before grabbing Beru by the torso. Beru thrashed violently in her grasp, roaring in fury. Yet no matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't break free. The crushing weight of her mana held him tight. He couldn't reach Jinwoo. Not like this. Jinwoo dropped to his knees, breath ragged, trying to steady himself after the brutal hit. The beast monarch raised his weapon once more, preparing to deliver the finishing blow. And in that moment, Beru's rage boiled over. His voice rang across the battlefield as he screamed his king's name, calling upon the other shadows to come forth and defend their lord. Suddenly, the ice across the ground began to fracture, deep cracks webbing outward in every direction. Then, two glowing red eyes pierced through the darkness beneath. Greed was the first to shatter the ice, his massive form bursting forth in answer to Beru's desperate cry. One after another, the higher-ranking shadows broke free. Igris, with his flaming blade, Iron stomping forward with his massive shield, and Tusk already preparing his magic. Their roars thundered across the battlefield as they rallied, driven by one purpose, to destroy anything that dared threaten their king. From a distance, Scyld and Raken watched the growing storm. The monarchs could feel the tide shifting, but neither dared retreat. Not yet. Scyld looked down at Jinwoo, noting the deep wounds and blood staining his hunter gear. The human was falling apart. The end was in sight. Or so he believed. Jinwoo slowly looked up, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. And then, in a calm voice that sent a chill through the air, he activated status effect recovery. As if time bent to his will, the wounds on his body began to heal, slowly at first, then faster, closing with each passing second. The monarchs stared, wide-eyed and stunned, as the man they believed to be on the verge of death began to rise again, body steady, breath even, and eyes burning with renewed fire. The disaster unfolding in Seoul had captured the world's attention. Across the globe, people stopped in their tracks, eyes glued to live broadcasts as Sung Jinwoo stood alone against three monarchs. Back in Korea, Leonard was among the few who could keep up with the chaos unfolding. Standing nearby, he watched in stunned silence as a violent storm of power surged across the battlefield. Beside him, Thomas Andre, still gravely wounded and surrounded by healers, asked what was happening. But even Leonard struggled to form an answer. The scene before him didn't feel like a battle. It felt like the end of the world. From another vantage point, Beck watched too, his eyes wide with awe. He'd always known Jinwoo possessed frightening potential, but this was something else entirely. The sheer pressure rolling off Jinwoo's presence was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Then, the battlefield erupted once more. Igris and Iron charged the Beast Monarch with full force, their combined assault shaking the very ground. At the same time, Tusk and Greed coordinated a pincer strike against the Frost Monarch, launching simultaneous attacks from both flanks. Beru, meanwhile, had just broken free from Kurosha's grotesque grasp by slicing through her twisted fingers. Enraged, the Plague Monarch lunged at him, her form a blur of venom and fury, but she failed to notice Jinwoo, who was already behind her, daggers drawn, his eyes gleaming with quiet rage. Jinwoo's mind flickered back to the architect's prophecy that he would die by a pillar of flame holding up the world. But nowhere had it said the pillar couldn't fall. With that thought, he slashed downward. His daggers cut clean through Kurosha's body, drawing a scream of agony from the monarch as he landed beside her, blades dripping. But even before he could catch his breath, her body began to reform, grotesque limbs and torn flesh twisting back together, regenerating at an unnatural speed. Furious now, she unleashed a wave of poisonous energy, filling the air with a noxious miasma that choked the battlefield. Yet Jinwoo stood unmoved. He knew this poison held no sway over him. The system had already detoxified every trace of her attack. Kurosha shrieked, her rage boiling over, her form twisted once more, transforming into a monstrous insect, towering and wild, razor-sharp mandibles snapping as she lunged toward him. But midway through her charge, her body stopped cold, suspended in midair. Jinwoo had silently activated ruler's authority. The Plague Monarch trembled in place, her limbs paralyzed against the invisible pressure. Jinwoo narrowed his eyes and, without a word, drove her back with a powerful strike, then activated mutilation. His movements turned into a deadly blur, each slash powered by Kamish's wrath, his blade glowing with dark, destructive energy. Kureisha could do nothing but watch in horror as Jinwoo's blade tore through her over and over again, carving her apart with cold, efficient precision. Her grotesque form shattered beneath his onslaught. Jinwoo passed through her crumbling body, stopping only once he reached the other side, his aura pulsing with pure, unmatched power. Behind him, the Plague Monarch's twisted body began to fall apart, piece by piece, eaten away by the force of Jinwoo's strikes. And in her final seconds, she felt it, the pull of something vast and eternal, an all-consuming darkness. With her last breath, she stared in awe at the brilliance of the force before her. A notification flickered into view, confirming the defeat of Kureisha, the Plague Monarch. Moments later, a cascade of alerts followed. Jinwoo had leveled up. Far from the subjugation site, an elite assassin from the Fiend Guild observed Seoul burning under the flames of destruction. He had been standing by for some time now, awaiting a signal to launch support fire. That was his role, a sniper waiting for the perfect shot. But after seeing a world-class hunter like Thomas Andre go down, doubt crept in. Were their chances ever real to begin with? As he stood lost in thought, a cold grip suddenly clutched his shoulder, yanking him back to reality. His heart pounded as a low, bone-chilling whisper crept up behind him, telling him to just sit back and watch. Instinct took over. He spun around, drawing an arrow in a flash, but there was no one there, just empty space. Back on the battlefield, the tide was shifting. The collapse of the Plague Monarch sent ripples of panic through the enemy. Silid, watching from a distance, trembled in disbelief. He couldn't fathom how Jinwoo wielded the Shadow Monarch's power with such devastating efficiency. That power, once feared across the cosmos, was now rising again through a human host. But the Beast Monarch dismissed the Frost Monarch's fears. He scoffed, claiming Jinwoo was merely hanging on. Clutching Beru by the neck, Raken sneered, mocking Jinwoo's reliance on his summons as he spat that an incomplete monarch could never stand against them. Beru let out a pained screech as his form flickered, his life force draining rapidly. Jinwoo's heart raced at the sight, panic surging as he attempted to recall Beru, but the system denied his command. The message was cold, irrevocable. Jinwoo's fury exploded. In an instant, he lunged at Raken and struck him with a devastating blow, sending the Beast Monarch hurtling away and breaking Beru free from his grip. Beru dropped, barely clinging to existence, but alive. The weight of battle bore down on Jinwoo, but there was no time to recover. Silid, stirred by Raken's earlier words, began transforming. His body swelled as an icy glacier spiraled toward the sky. Ice smoke curled from his mouth as he spoke with cold disdain, warning Jinwoo that he was placing too much faith in his power that still lacked an owner. His transformation complete, Silid unsheathed a trident pulsing with otherworldly energy. He raised the weapon, his voice like frost, as he declared that he would trap Jinwoo's shadow army in a vicious cycle of healing and death, turning them into parasites that would slowly drain him of mana. He lunged forward, trident swinging with a chilling aura. Jinwoo blocked it with his daggers, but the sheer force sliced into his shoulder, blood spraying across the ground. Silid didn't let up. He spun the trident and slammed it into the earth, shattering the battlefield, but Jinwoo vanished before the blow could connect. Silid blinked, scanning the terrain. Suddenly, Jinwoo reappeared behind him, daggers aimed for the Frost Monarch's eyes, but Silid turned just in time, avoiding the strike and countering with a brutal hit to Jinwoo's torso. The impact shattered ribs, blood bursting from Jinwoo's mouth as his body was hurled through the air like a ragdoll. Despite the blow, Jinwoo regained his footing. His breath came in ragged gasps, pain burning through every nerve. He had underestimated Silid's speed. This wasn't the same opponent he had faced before. Silid advanced, eyes cold and focused. Their weapons clashed in a flurry of strikes, each swing faster, heavier, more lethal than the last. Jinwoo watched every movement, analyzed every breath and shift in mana flow, seeking even the smallest opening. But Silid didn't flinch. In his mind, this fight was already decided. With weapons now in both hands, the Frost Monarch unleashed a storm of ice, but before the attack could land, Jinwoo had already slipped behind him, eyes locked on his target, thinking he had finally found his moment to strike. But just as he moved, Silid turned with a smirk. And then, everything froze. Jinwoo's body stopped. His strength drained in an instant. The world turned dark as pain erupted through his chest. Silence fell. Hunters nearby stood in stunned disbelief. Claws, sharp and merciless, had pierced through Jinwoo's back. Blood poured from the wounds, soaking the earth. Behind him, fully transformed into his monstrous werewolf form, stood Raken. The beast monarch grinned as his claws sank deeper. Jinwoo's body trembled, his breath faltered, and as blood spilled from his lips, the realization sank in. He'd been caught, and death was staring him right in the eyes. As his strength began to fade from the loss of blood, the daggers slipped from Jinwoo's grasp, clattering to the ground with a metallic clang. His body was weakening, but his mind struggled to stay focused. This should have been manageable, he thought bitterly. His level had increased. He'd grown stronger. And yet, the brutal reality proved otherwise. The Frost Monarch stepped forward, the air growing colder with each measured step. In his hand, he held one of Jinwoo's daggers, now encased in a cruel sheen of ice. Without hesitation, Scylla drove the frozen blade into Jinwoo's chest, piercing deep. Blood surged from Jinwoo's mouth, the wound gushing crimson as the Frost Monarch sneered, daring him to heal again like he did earlier. Scylla twisted the blade further, mocking that Jinwoo was still incomplete, just a broken imitation of the true Shadow Monarch. As Jinwoo's life force waned, the Frost Monarch continued his vile sermon, painting a grim future for humanity once their army arrived. There would be mountains of corpses, rivers of blood, and for Jinwoo's homeland, an even crueler fate awaited. Scylla vowed to freeze every living being in Korea, imprisoning them in eternal suffering, neither dead nor alive. Jinwoo could do nothing but endure the horrifying vision as ice began crawling through his veins. His limbs went numb, his senses dulled, and his vision faded into darkness. As consciousness slipped away, he sank into an endless void, cold, quiet, and absolute. Then, as if the abyss itself had a voice, a message echoed through the silence. Player HP has reached 0. Another followed instantly, cruel in its finality. The player has died. Everything fell still, the notifications gone, until the screen flickered. The player possesses the Black Heart. A new window emerged from the void, revealing that all requirements for an unknown passive skill had been met. Without delay, the system activated the hidden skill, and a searing light burst through the darkness, engulfing everything. The next instant, Jinwoo's eyes flew open, his body drenched in sweat, chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. He gasped, struggling to steady his breath as scattered thoughts crashed through his mind. Memories of the battlefield and his last moments flooded back in vivid detail. His hand flew to his chest, the sensation of the ice dagger still etched in his nerves, yet he was alive. Just moments ago, he'd been locked in a brutal fight for survival against the monarchs. Now it all felt distant, like a fading nightmare. Yet one thing was certain to Jinwoo. He was in a hospital. Confusion gnawed at him as he sat up slowly. Then, the door opened and Woo Jinchul stepped in, accompanied by a subordinate. Jinwoo's eyes widened in disbelief, and he asked, breathless, if the chairman had survived the monarch's assault. Jinchul blinked, taken aback. After a scoff, he corrected him. He wasn't the chairman, just the chief inspector of the surveillance team. He had come to question Jinwoo about the moving statues. Then, with a cautious stare, Jinchul asked how Jinwoo even knew him. This, after all, was their first meeting. Jinwoo's heart pounded. Nothing made sense. Jinchul's words drifted in the background as he explained how the surveillance team and White Tiger Guild had found him unconscious, but Jinwoo wasn't listening. He knew this room. He'd been here before, after the double dungeon. 2 weeks he'd spent recovering in this very bed. The déjà vu was overwhelming. Jinchul remarked offhandedly that Jinwoo looked different from his photo. The words deepened Jinwoo's disconnection from reality. Everything pointed to one terrifying truth. The timeline had shifted, and he was caught between the past and something far more ominous. Trying to maintain composure, Jinwoo excused himself. He needed time to think. He dressed quickly, the confusion still clouding his mind. But even amidst the chaos in his thoughts, one thing was undeniable. His stats remained. So did Kamish's wrath. Somehow, he had returned to the past, with everything. Before he could process it, the door burst open. Jinna, his sister, stood there staring at him. She looked shocked, as if seeing a stranger in her brother's place. She stammered, asking if he was really Jinwoo. He seemed different. Jinwoo brushed aside her concern. He told her he had to leave, urgently, and that he was going to the Hunter Association to resign. Jinna's eyes widened at the sudden declaration. That wasn't something she ever expected to hear. Then Jinwoo glanced toward the quiet figure behind her, Han Song-yi. Without pause, he told her not to abandon her studies to become a hunter. Song-yi blinked in disbelief, clearly shaken. She asked how he knew her name. They'd never met before. But Jinwoo had already turned away, his thoughts elsewhere. The shadows were gone, but he would rebuild them. What mattered now was understanding how and why this reset had happened. Arriving at the Hunter Association, he submitted himself for re-evaluation. The device meant to measure his magic power had failed completely to register a reading. They were awestruck, but Jinwoo didn't care. He already knew what they were whispering and had no interest in proving himself again. What he wanted was a meeting with the chairman. The employee hesitated before offering to guide him, but Jinwoo declined, stating he already knew where the office was. As he walked through the familiar halls, the employee stood frozen, puzzled. How could an outsider like Jinwoo know the layout so well? At last, Jinwoo finally reached President Go's office. As he stepped inside, his expression shifted slightly, a subtle trace of something old and familiar passing through his eyes. It had been a long time since he last stood before the chairman. President Go greeted him with a light chuckle, noting how Jinwoo seemed to know his way around already, heading straight to him after receiving his test results. The chairman's tone was direct, ready to address formalities and paperwork, but Jinwoo's mind was elsewhere. Just as the conversation began, a translucent message blinked into view, asking if he wanted to restart the world. But Jinwoo dismissed it, pushing it to the edge of his consciousness for now. There were more important things to handle first. As President Go began speaking, Jinwoo cut in with a proposal. It wasn't a request. It was a deal. He wanted the association to change its regulations to officially recognize summoned creatures as raid participants. In return, he would eliminate the Jeju Island ants once and for all. The chairman blinked, momentarily thrown off by the absurdity of it. He reminded Jinwoo that countless attempts had already failed, that Jeju Island had become a graveyard for even the strongest hunters. But before he could continue, his words faltered as something shifted in the room. Dark energy began to surge around Jinwoo, rising like smoke, yet heavier than gravity itself. President Go froze. His breath caught in his throat as he felt the sheer magnitude of Jinwoo's presence. It was too vast, too foreign, the kind of power that didn't belong to the world he knew. Jinwoo, completely calm as the pressure mounted, met the chairman's gaze and said without pride or hesitation that this was something only he could accomplish. But President Go wasn't listening anymore. His thoughts were spinning, struggling to process the unnatural force before him. And then, just as suddenly, Jinwoo's vision blurred with a rush of memories. The cycle had begun again, dragging his thoughts through the timeline like a torrent. He remembered the Dungeon of Lizards, where Dong-suk and his team had tried to betray him and died for it. Then Kang Tae-shik, the assassin in disguise, whose blade never reached its mark. He saw himself trapped once more in the Red Gate, where he faced the white-furred beast that would later become Tank. Then the Hunters Guild raid, where high orcs had fallen one by one and Tusk had knelt in submission. The notifications for restarting the world kept flashing endlessly, forcing Jinwoo to endure the relentless repetition like a torment with no escape. He saw Demon Castle again, where he'd claimed the flames and brought his mother back from her eternal sleep. He saw Jeju Island and Beru's first kneel, the battlefield soaked in ant blood. But it didn't stop. Over and over, the system pounded him with the same message, forcing him through the same story, the same rise, the same outcomes. It was endless, and it wasn't real. Frustration boiled over as Jinwoo shouted into the emptiness, rejecting the illusion. Something was doing this to him, something external, watching, laughing. A wave of power surged outward as a shadowy domain erupted beneath his feet, swallowing everything it touched. The system bombarded Jinwoo with notification after notification, the words flashing violently across his vision, each one asking the same question, whether he would like to restart the world. Then he felt it. A presence. Something was approaching, drawing closer through the veil of shadows. Jinwoo turned. From the heart of the devouring darkness, a lone figure emerged. Its silhouette was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the black fog like a blade. Clad in gleaming, intricately etched black armor, the figure strode forward with the quiet authority of one who belonged here, like death incarnate wearing a crown. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the void as the figure that emerged offered Jinwoo a tempting proposition: to remain in this world forever, wrapped in the comfort of an endless dream. But Jinwoo's instincts flared. This world was too perfect, too still. He saw through the illusion, his sharp gaze cutting into the shadows. This was a lie, a carefully crafted trap. He met the figure's gaze and asked coldly what the true purpose behind the offer was, but the figure's response was cold and measured as he told Jinwoo he hadn't created this fabricated world. In fact, it was Jinwoo himself who had shaped this illusion. The words sank in slowly, and Jinwoo's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Yet the figure continued, his form shifting through different human exteriors as he stepped closer, explaining that this world was born from Jinwoo's deepest desires, the need to fix the past, to erase his mistakes. That longing, combined with his own power, had birthed this place, a territory of death, a realm of eternal rest where no escape existed. Jinwoo stood frozen as the weight of it all pressed down on him. The figure explained that Jinwoo had resisted death time and time again, danced on the edge of mortality with every fiber of his being, but death had always been there, watching, waiting. The figure's presence weighed heavier with each passing second as he revealed he wasn't just a bystander, he was a part of Jinwoo, the embodiment of all he had fought against, and a mirror of his deepest struggles. His voice echoed low and steady as he declared himself death itself, eternal rest, endless terror, and the shadow of Jinwoo's soul. This territory, he explained, was under Jinwoo's control. Within it, he could do anything. Creation, destruction, manipulation, all of it was his to command. The figure claimed the power Jinwoo held was identical to his own, and that made them kindred spirits in this eternal game. He had been watching for what felt like forever, waiting for their meeting, knowing it was inevitable. Finally, Figure revealed himself as the Shadow Monarch, the King of Death, ruler of the deepest reaches of the void. Jinwoo, still reeling from the revelations, demanded in a steady but shaken voice why he had been chosen. The Shadow Monarch's voice echoed once more, steady and vast, as he promised to show Jinwoo everything, the beginning, the end, and the truth behind his very existence. Meanwhile, at the battlefield, Jinwoo's body lay frozen, locked inside a prison of ice. The Beast Monarch stood over him, his gaze filled with certainty as he concluded that Jinwoo was dead. From a distance, Thomas Andre felt something shift, his senses telling him that Jinwoo's presence had vanished. Confusion laced his voice as he questioned what had just happened. Leonard, standing nearby, struggled to find words, even though deep down, he knew the truth. Beck's voice trembled with disbelief, the realization sinking in that with Jinwoo gone, who could possibly stand against the overwhelming might of the magical beast? But then, a shift in the air made everything come to a standstill. The Frost Monarch, standing tall and proud after what he believed to be his victory, suddenly sensed a surge of mana emanating from Jinwoo's seemingly lifeless body. His eyes widened in disbelief, unable to comprehend the unfolding events. Raken's expression mirrored the same shock as realization hit him with force. Something was about to happen. Jinwoo's black heart, once still, began to beat rapidly, burning with the power to rebirth itself. Both monarchs knew what this meant. The true Shadow Monarch was on the brink of resurrection, and they couldn't let that happen. The urgency surged through them, and without hesitation, they lunged toward Jinwoo's frozen form, determined to strike him down before the rebirth could take place. But before they could land their blows, the Beast Monarch was met with a crushing strike to the face. The blow sent him reeling, his vision spinning. Stunned, the two monarchs barely had time to react when another powerful strike hit them, sending them crashing to the ground with an earth-shattering impact. The mysterious figure who had intervened landed gracefully. With a swift motion, he unsheathed two gleaming daggers. It was Sung Il-hwan. Clad in a shimmering golden robe, he stood as an imposing figure between the monarchs and Jinwoo. His voice, low but commanding, echoed through the air as he declared that from this moment forward, no one would lay a hand on his child. Jinwoo, now cut off from reality, stepped into the Shadow Monarch's realm as the tale began, of a world that once knew only light and darkness. In the beginning of another world, there existed only light and darkness. The Absolute Being, in his infinite power, divided the light to create the emissaries of God and split the darkness to give birth to the 8 monarchs. These two opposing forces were each given a distinct purpose. While the monarchs existed to destroy, the emissaries were created to protect. And so began a never-ending war, a brutal cycle where both sides clashed repeatedly, annihilating each other's armies without end. Among the emissaries, the brightest fragment of brilliant light grew weary. Endless bloodshed had dulled even the divine spark within him, and he sought the audience of the Absolute Being. With desperation veiled beneath his reverence, he begged for guidance, pleaded for the power to end the war once and for all, to exterminate the monarchs and bring peace. But the Absolute Being remained silent. He offered no answers, no salvation, as if the lives of his creations held no weight at all. And in that silence, the emissary understood a horrifying truth. The war was not divine will. It was a spectacle, entertainment for the Absolute Being. The God they had served, praised, and bled for had no desire for peace. Their devotion had meant nothing. They had followed his laws without question, believing obedience would spare them. But death came regardless. The realization shattered their faith. And in that shattering came resolve. They raised their blades, not against the monarchs, but against their own creator. Thus began the rebellion. It wasn't hatred that drove them, but the desire to end a senseless war, a war devoid of meaning. a war that would never end as long as the absolute being sat above them. Now, as the Shadow Monarch stood before Jinwoo, he pointed toward a glowing figure at the forefront of an ancient army, a six-winged being of divine brilliance. That had been him, long ago, the only emissary who had refused to rebel, the last to raise his weapon in defense of their creator. But his efforts had been in vain. His soldiers were overwhelmed, crushed by the unity of the traitorous emissaries. In his final moments, he believed his story had ended. Yet, when he opened his eyes again, it was in the depths of darkness. There, within the abyss, he discovered something hidden inside him, a power implanted by the absolute being, a final failsafe to be awakened should everything go wrong. The divine light that had once marked him was gone. His wings, scorched and ruined, were torn away, and in their place, he forged new armor from the surrounding darkness. Thus was born the Shadow Monarch, no longer an emissary, no longer a servant of light. He became the king of the dead. With his new power and his growing army of the fallen, he returned to the battlefield, but it was already over. The other fragments of brilliant light had slain the absolute being. They had declared themselves the new gods and called themselves rulers. With their new authority, the rulers wielded divine tools left behind by their creator, artifacts imbued with the absolute being's power. And with those tools, they hunted the monarchs. Legia, the king of giants, was one of the first to fall. Captured and imprisoned by the rulers, his defeat shattered the balance between the two forces. Realizing that survival was no longer possible without unity, the monarchs were forced to accept an alliance with the Shadow Monarch. Together, they prepared to stand against their common enemy. From that moment forward, he no longer fought for the absolute being or as an emissary. He embraced his identity as the Shadow Monarch. With every battle, his army grew. Each corpse, each soul feeding the strength of his undead legion. When the war reached its boiling point, the Shadow Monarch forged a pact with the army of destruction, led by the fearsome king of berserk dragons. Their union shook even the monarchs themselves. He had grown too powerful, too unpredictable. Fear turned to treachery. The Monarch of White Flames and the Beast Monarch conspired against him. Their betrayal nearly wiped out his entire army. The strength he had once wielded became the reason for his downfall. While the Beast Monarch fled, abandoning even his own soldiers, Baran, the king of demons, paid for his treachery with his life. In the aftermath, 4 rulers descended from the sky, their presence oppressive yet quiet. He stood ready to face them, even alone, but they did not attack. Instead, they knelt. One of the rulers addressed him not as an enemy, but with reverence, as the greatest fragment of brilliant light. Their words were humble. They asked for forgiveness. They claimed the war no longer held meaning. The fury boiled within him. How dare they speak of peace? The ruler quietly acknowledged that they, too, had once served the absolute being. But the moment those words left his mouth, the Shadow Monarch's fury surged. He seized the ruler by the face, his grip unrelenting. That admission didn't bring understanding. It made the betrayal all the more unforgivable. They had turned their backs on the very being they were created to serve. The ruler's voice, however, was calm. They reminded him that he, more than anyone, knew the burden of rebellion, knew what it meant to be consumed by sorrow and rage. And still, they begged, not for mercy, but for peace. The Shadow Monarch's grip loosened. He gazed upward, and for the first time, he saw them, his old comrades, the army of brilliant light. They saluted him, not with defiance, but allegiance. Overwhelmed, the Shadow Monarch felt helpless. Even with all his power, he couldn't find peace. Revenge had been his anchor. But now, the war was losing its meaning. So, he made the decision to go into hiding. After sealing the Monarch of White Flames within himself, his plan was simple. Recover his strength first, then strike back against the Beast Monarch's forces when the time was right. But in his absence, the monarchs grew weak and eventually fell, defeated at the hands of the rulers. And when he finally re-emerged, the remaining monarchs were already fleeing, escaping into dimensional cracks. Before he could confront them, the Dragon King intervened, forbidding any form of conflict. He understood the need for strength above all else. And so, the Shadow Monarch was welcomed once more into the monarchs' ranks. With their alliance restored, the monarchs began their search for a new world, one where they could rebuild their forces in secret, beyond the reach of the ruler's gaze. And then, they found Earth. Jinwoo stood in silence, his thoughts spiraling. Visions of cities in flames burned in his mind, too vivid to be mere imagination. He had seen this before, back in the demon castle. He turned toward the Shadow Monarch, his voice low and tinged with dread, asking if this was a vision of the future. But the Shadow Monarch's reply echoed clearly in his mind. This was not a glimpse of what was to come, but a memory of what had already been, a record of the past. The devastation he was witnessing had already unfolded long ago. The Shadow Monarch explained that the monarchs were born of destruction, their very existence bound to it, while the rulers were created to preserve balance in a world left behind by the absolute being. So, when the rulers finally became aware of the monarch's movements, they dispatched their armies to Earth, but their response came too late. By then, humanity had already been ravaged. The rulers, furious over their failure to prevent the devastation, knew the consequences of their inaction. The monarchs had once again annihilated a world, and the rulers could not allow this to continue. In their anger and desperation, they turned to a forbidden tool they had sworn never to use, the Cup of Reincarnation. This divine artifact, infused with the power of the absolute being, had the ability to turn back time by 10 years. Desperate to undo the destruction, the rulers sacrificed everything, using their final measure to reverse the damage. But Earth, small, fragile, and devoid of mana, was unprepared for what was coming. The war, no matter who won, would leave only ashes in its wake. Faced with this grim reality, the rulers made a difficult choice. Aware they couldn't save all, they decided to focus on preserving the survival of a few. That was how hunters came to be. Humans, gifted with strength, meant to endure the storm. Mankind's final hope against the collision of monarchs and rulers. Jinwu found himself deep in thought, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The demon king he had once fought, a towering foe in his past, had been nothing more than a fragment, an echo of memories left behind by the Shadow Monarch. The chilling reality settled in as Jinwu murmured to himself that the world had already faced countless annihilations. This cycle of destruction and rebirth, it had repeated endlessly. The Shadow Monarch confirmed it. The higher beings, monarchs and rulers alike, couldn't alter time, not directly. But they had perceived its shifts, observed the subtle changes brought about by the Cup of Reincarnation. The rulers had tried to correct the course, while the monarchs kept shifting their tactics, adapting again and again until the divine artifact could no longer be used. That revelation unsettled Jinwu even more. If even the powers that governed reality had limits, then what hope was there for anything else to endure? The Shadow Monarch explained that no power was truly infinite. Even the Cup of Reincarnation, despite its ability to rewind time, had its limits. Just like the absolute being, once mighty enough to shape entire worlds, yet still overthrown by his own creations. Jinwu's voice was low, almost hesitant, as he questioned how creations could defeat the one who made them. The Shadow Monarch replied that it wasn't so different from humans falling to the machines they'd built. The monarchs had evolved beyond servitude. They began devising their own strategies, even borrowing from the ruler's playbook. Just as the rulers had empowered humans to rise against the magical beasts, the monarchs had planned to descend using human vessels. Through those bodies, they would infiltrate Earth and unleash their armies far earlier than the rulers had anticipated. Their plan was bold: transform the very magic energy meant to save the world into a trap, one that would doom the rulers' forces the moment they arrived. The pieces fell into place in Jinwu's mind. The monarchs weren't here to conquer slowly. They wanted a massacre, a decisive ambush. And to make that happen, they needed hosts strong enough to bear their essence. However, both the Shadow Monarch and the Monarch of Destruction wielded power far beyond what any ordinary human could endure. Finding a suitable vessel was no easy task. It was a burden few could ever hope to carry. That was when the architect had stepped forward. The most brilliant mage under one of the kings had come with a proposition. He would help the Shadow Monarch find a host in exchange for an imperishable body. But the Shadow Monarch's power was rooted in death. No living being could house it. Still, the architect was undeterred. He crafted a system to seek out a human who could endure the overwhelming force. It was a monumental task. Years passed. Countless failed. And then the system found Jinwu. He had always been weak, constantly teetering on the edge of death. Yet somehow he had defied it every single time. So, despite the architect's objections, the Shadow Monarch made his decision and chose Jinwu as his vessel. He told Jinwu that he was the living record of his struggles, the proof of his defiance, and the reward born from all his suffering. Jinwu's thoughts spiraled as he tried to make sense of it all. Despite passing every test, he had still believed he wasn't strong enough. The Shadow Monarch corrected him. He hadn't been, not at first. That's why the architect created the system, to gradually reshape Jinwu, using the player framework to steadily condition him for the overwhelming power he was destined to inherit. And yet, even with this understanding, Jinwu couldn't let go of one question. Why had the monarch betrayed the architect? The Shadow Monarch hesitated, his expression clouded for the first time. He finally broke his silence, each word carrying the weight of countless years. He spoke of the ruler's apology, the betrayal of the monarchs, and the endless days he had spent watching Jinwu from afar. He pondered long and hard on where he truly belonged, and the more he watched Jinwoo, the stronger his desire to remain grew. Ultimately, he made his decision, a choice he embraced with clarity. He didn't want to lose Jinwoo. For him, it ran deeper than duty or fate. He had become Jinwoo, and Jinwoo had become him. Their bond had grown inseparable. It no longer mattered who the original owner of the body was. They were now one and the same. And with that understanding, the Shadow Monarch extended a final offer, a choice laid bare before Jinwoo. The Shadow Monarch proposed that Jinwoo could remain here, within the realm of death, embraced by eternal dreams shaped to bring him peace. He could finally rest. Or he could return to reality. Return to a world still teeming with enemies, where the struggle never ceased and the fight continued without end. Jinwoo stared at the army of destruction led by the Dragon Emperor, his face set in stone. Then, with quiet intensity, he asked the question that had been lingering in his mind. Why had the Shadow Monarch, who once chose not to fight, fled to another world with the monarchs instead of siding with the rulers? The Shadow Monarch's answer was calm, almost resigned. That world had no place for him. It was never where he belonged. Jinwoo made his choice without hesitation, echoing the monarch's own sentiment. This was not where he belonged either. The Shadow Monarch's gaze softened, a quiet contentment settling over him as he accepted the finality of it all. After countless trials, he could finally rest. With calm certainty, he explained that Jinwoo's power was now whole, and his soul immortal. Through this symbolic death, Jinwoo had been fully reborn as the new Shadow Monarch. They stood in silence, at the edge of parting. The monarch began to speak again, ready to guide Jinwoo back to the real world, but Jinwoo stopped him with a quiet smile, a subtle nod accompanying his words as he assured the monarch that he already knew the path. The monarch, now fully in his original form, looked upon Jinwoo one last time. There was pride in his gaze, fulfillment. After all his wandering, he had found his place. With that final moment, he stepped back, fading slowly into the darkness. Jinwoo looked up at the crimson-tinged sky. A storm brewed in the distance. His enemies awaited, and with a voice clear and unwavering, he spoke the word that would seal his rebirth as the one true Shadow Monarch. Arise. A cascade of notifications followed. The system began to unravel. The first message appeared with a chime that echoed through Jinwoo's consciousness. The deletion code for the player nurturing system had been entered. The very framework that had governed his growth, battles, and ascension was now reaching its end. As the process began, another prompt appeared, revealing that all restrictions on Jinwoo's power had been lifted. No longer bound by artificial limits, all commander-ranked shadow soldiers, including Beru and Igris, reclaimed their full potential. Another message confirmed what he already sensed deep within. The previous Shadow Monarch, Ashbourne, had returned to the world of eternal void. Then came the final message, asking Jinwoo whether he would like to delete the system. Without a hint of hesitation, he made his choice and pressed yes. The moment his finger confirmed the decision, the air trembled. Reality itself seemed to fracture as dimensional boundaries crackled and collapsed. The ascension of a new Shadow Monarch had begun. A violent gust of wind tore across the battlefield, followed by a burst of blinding light that threw both the Beast Monarch and Frost Monarch back. The pressure was suffocating. Disoriented, the Frost Monarch erupted with fury, his voice laced with venom as he snarled that Sung Huan was shielding the disaster that would bring ruin upon the world. It infuriated him that a fragment of light was now standing in the way, aiding the rebirth of the Shadow Monarch. Realizing the urgency, the Beast Monarch's instincts screamed. They didn't have much time left. With no other choice, the two monarchs braced themselves for an all-out onslaught before Jinwoo's transformation could fully complete. Sung Il-Huan, undaunted by their rage, took a reverse grip on his daggers and planted his feet firmly. There was no fear in his stance, only resolve. The monarch struck without warning, dashing from opposite directions. Speed and power surged through every movement, but Il-Huan met them head-on. With each clash, his daggers deflected Raken's wild slashes and Silid's thrusting trident. He responded with pinpoint counterattacks, striking with the calm and precision of a warrior who had lived through 1,000 battles. Frustration flickered in Silid's cold eyes. This wasn't just evasion. Il-Huan was reading them, predicting their movements with near supernatural clarity. Slipping behind Il-Huan, the Frost Monarch prepared to unleash a gust of bone-chilling wind to paralyze his target, but Il-Huan sensed it. In one fluid motion, he pivoted and launched a brutal kick directly under Silid's chin. The Frost Monarch was lifted off his feet and sent crashing through a nearby building. Raken, seeing his opportunity while Il-Huan's attention was diverted, lunged with his massive jaws spread wide, ready to devour him whole. But Il-Huan reacted in a flash. His dagger shot upward and lodged deep between the beast monarch's fangs. Raken let out a thunderous cry, staggering from the sudden agony, and before he could recover, Ilhuan drove its savage punch into his ribs, sending him skidding across the rubble.